Uh-oh. We good? How's everybody doing today? Good. It's a kind of damp, cold March Saturday, right? But it's good to be in the house of the Lord, and I'm happy to be with you today, all right? So we'll go to the first slide just to kind of set the stage, and I'll keep looking over there if that's okay. There you go. I thought what we would do, and I know it's kind of almost elementary, like good and evil. Everyone knows what good and evil is. But we live in a world that obviously good and evil is not always that easily discerned, at least from those outside of the church. So what I would like to do is to take a biblical look, and I mean by biblical, the whole thing, right? Because a lot of times as New Testament believers, we end up in the New Testament, but I want to try to give us a broader perspective. Let's go to the next slide. Let's just start with almost like a what-if experience, okay? Imagine living in among a people, among a culture, among a country, among a civilization, a nation, or whatever, that tried to, in a sense, live without the following, all right? Let's just kind of go with a bit of a thought experiment here. Can you imagine living among a people that had no sense of a higher authority? That in a sense, self was the ultimate authority, right? It's true because I say it's true. It's right because I say it's right. It's good for me to do because I wanted to. No one answers to anyone else but self. Can I suggest we would call that anarchy, right? That's the nature of anarchy, that no one rules in a sense, but everyone rules. Remember in Judges, there was no king and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Can you imagine living in a culture without any sense of time, that there would be no rhythms to life, right? No schedules. You wouldn't know when to go to bed. You wouldn't know when to get up. You wouldn't know when to go to work. You wouldn't know when to come home from work. There would be no sense of time for socialization. You wouldn't know, am I on vacation? Am I at the job? What am I supposed to do? Imagine if we lived in a world that just had absolutely no sense of time. All right, imagine what that would be like. And that's certainly something for us to think about. Third one. Imagine living in a world where, in a sense, there was no sense of authority or spheres of authority, all right? I like to, in fact, just yesterday in one of my classes, I was teaching politics, not as you normally think, Republicans and Democrats, but politics in the sense of how do people get along in groups, right? And one of the things that we struggle with the most in doing that are what we call spheres or domains. So if you can kind of picture in your head just a blank screen with circles all over it. And in one circle, you write the word church. In another circle, you write the word family. In another, you write, state or society. In another, business. In another, education. And each of those spheres are actually God-given, but they each have a certain domain of authority to it, right? And what we struggle with as a people, when does the state get to tell the family what to do? When does the state get to tell the church what to do? When does the church get to tell the state what to do? What about the education? Does state rule that? And it's all those circles. But imagine if there were no circles. Imagine if there were just one big circle. And you know what that's called? That's Marxism, right? Marxist ideology is that, in a sense, the collective owns everything. And in that sense, all those different spheres that we, in a sense, take for granted, we live with every day. Can you imagine a world where there were no circles? There was just one big circle, in a sense, telling everyone what's right, what's wrong, etc. All right. Imagine living in a world where there was no sense of the value of human life. All right. On the one hand, the elderly. On the other hand, the preborn, if you will, children, the handicapped. That each of these vulnerable ones, if we can call it that, each of these are simply at the mercy of the strong or the determined. Right? Are you familiar with the Darwinian worldview? Survival of the fittest. Might makes right. Imagine living in a world where that would be true. And in a sense, we already have an example of that. We go back to World War II, right, with the Nazis. They kind of had that understanding, and so the infirmed, the children, certain ethnic groups, might makes right, and imagine that there's no respect for human life, especially again the weak among us, right, or the vulnerable among us. Imagine living in a world without any set of boundaries. All right, it kind of goes back to our circle imagery, right? You slept with anybody you wanted to, you cared for or ignored anyone you wanted to. You can ignore your offspring, you can raise your offspring. What's yours is mine, and what's mine is yours. In a sense, there's just no boundaries. All right, you go out to the parking lot and someone's taking your car because it's not really your car; it's their car at their disposal, and you have to find someone else's car. Well, it's not really their car; it's your car because now you've taken. Just imagine the mayhem, right? The world that would be that if there's, in a sense, no boundaries, especially in the element of life and those kind of things. Imagine living without any sense of property rights. I don't know if you're following in the news, though, that a lot of people are struggling with squatters, right? And apparently, I guess if you go to a place and stay 20 years, it's yours, right? So find a house you like, just go live on the back lawn, stay there for 20 years, and then claim it's yours. And the world says, okay, yeah, it's squatter rights. But just imagine that. What's yours is mine, and obviously what's mine is mine. You thought I was going to say what's yours is mine and what's mine is yours. No. What's yours is mine and what's mine is mine, right? Again, might makes right. And again, we're back to kind of almost a Marxist ideology, if you will. Even Marxists, in a sense, struggle with property rights. Right? And for them, the struggle is that the collective owns everything. So we believe in individual property rights, right? They're going to believe in a collective. We're still arguing over who owns it, who gets to determine its use and all of those things. All right. Imagine living in a world without any regard to truth. Here's one for you. Imagine next time you go to fill up your car at the gas station and you put the gas thing in the nozzle in your tank and shh. And there was no sticker on the pump that said, this has been approved, that you're actually getting a gallon of gas. Is there something to think about that? Did you ever see little stickers? They have to go around because how do you know that the gallon is the gallon? You might be getting a half gallon but paying for the gallon. The only way you would do that is, can you imagine? Every time you go to fill up your gas, you'd have to have a gallon container, fill it up first, pour it in, fill it up first, pour it in, because there was no truth. There was no way to kind of protect that because it's, hey, buyer beware, right? Imagine going to the store and buying meat and there's no little FDA approved on that, right? How do you know what you're buying? Maybe you think you're buying beef and you're really buying horse. You don't know, right? And in that sense, yeah, right? And maybe horse is good. I don't know. I've never had horse. I've had buffalo, but never horse. So it's just like, I don't know. What do you do with that, right? Imagine that. Imagine if we lived in a world where everything was fake news. Are you guys familiar with the old novel, 1984? The Newspeak, right? The Ministry of Truth, that was all about propaganda. The Ministry of Peace, that was really the War Department. That everything is just backwards because it's not plain speech. Yes is not yes and no is not no. Can you imagine living in a world like that? Can you imagine living in a world where motivation didn't matter? Just kind of allow that to set in. Motives don't matter. Only what you did mattered. Think about it in a couple of different ways. How would you ever even distinguish issues of homicide? Right? In our jurisprudence, we have first degree, second degree, third degree. In each of them, we still have a dead person. What are we really arguing there? What's the motive? Motive. Right? Is it intent, planned? Was it an act of passion? Was it more just accidental? But imagine in a world that motive didn't matter. Only end product mattered, right? What would that look like? In fact, I don't know if you're familiar with, we kind of moved from, in our culture, in our world, from a really clear, defined understanding of good and evil. Think about the books that you read or the TV shows that you watch or the movies. Your hero is the good guy and the villain is the bad guy. You have a protagonist and you have an antagonist, right? We understand that. We certainly all grew up with that. But now we live in the age of the anti-hero. I don't know if you've ever heard about the anti-hero in the movies and in the stories. And what an anti-hero is, and they usually go one of two ways. It's the person who does the right thing for all the wrong reasons, or they do the wrong thing for all the right reasons. So either they end up doing good, but they didn't really want to. They're not really all that good inside. Or they don't do the right thing, but everyone's, oh man, but their heart was in the right place. You could not talk about that in a world that does not consider motives. All right, so motives are obvious. obviously really, really significant. Okay, we live in a world, as the Bible says, that people call good evil and evil good. Everything we just talked about is flipped. Right? It's an upside down world. And can I suggest that it's becoming more upside down the further we go along, right? If you're reading what's going on in the news and you're hearing what people are saying, I don't know, you just scratch your head and you say, like, really? How did we get to this place, right? What does this actually look like? It becomes more and more inverted. So that's the reason why I thought it would be good if we talk about good and evil. And if we talk about good and evil, not because we don't know, but that we can have a clear understanding, definition, explanation, so that when we talk to those around us, we can have a clear picture of what actually constitutes good, what actually constitutes evil. And what I would like to do, and if you've been thinking, right, which you have been, what I would like to do is actually look at it through the grid of the 10 Commandments. All right, the 10 Commandments are still universally held to be some sort of a description of a moral code. It's still universally recognized. Now, granted, it's being fought against, right? The whole thing, should we have 10 Commandments outside the courthouses and those sorts of things? So I'm not suggesting that it's not in conflict. It is in conflict, but still, it's the reason that they're still there is everyone recognizes that somehow this is a description of morality. Everyone should be able to get this. All right? And so that's why I thought it would be good. Our frame of reference this morning will be the 10 Commandments. We'll look at that. We'll look at it through the various grid of both New Testament and Old Testament. We'll try to explain that so we can go out saying, no, you know, boy, if we didn't have truth, if we didn't have those little stickers on the the gas pumps, it'd be like, what kind of a world would it be? All right, and that's what we want to try to do. Okay, my logic today really works for me. I have no idea if my logic is going to work for you. Okay? So in one sense, my notes, I'm starting here and I'm going there, and it just to me like makes sense. This is how we should proceed. I'm hoping that you will say, oh yeah, that makes logical sense. We can connect that. If it doesn't, I apologize in advance. It will just be a window into the craziness of my mind, and you'll go out totally confused. But hopefully that's certainly not the goal. All right? The goal is for you to be able to kind of follow through and get there. So, ready? Let's put our crash helmets on. We got a lot of work ahead of us. All right, let's go to the next slide. I think the first thing we need to do, because we're talking about the Old Testament, is we need to understand what's the best way to read the Old Testament, right? Because one of the things that we really struggle with is how do New Testament believers understand Old Testament, whether it's the law, the 10 Commandments, the Old Testament in general. And actually, this goes back to a couple of ideas that we dealt with, I think it was 2 years ago, right? Last year, I think we did the Spirit. The previous year, we did hermeneutics. So this is a little bit of a review, but it's going to help us. And right up front, you're going to see that not everyone agrees that we should look at the Old Testament in the same way. All right, so you have to know the views, and then you kind of can decide, well, what are you going to do and how are you going to process it? All right, so let's see if this makes sense. The first view, it's called the dispensational view, and this is what they believe. And we may have everyone in the house, right? Some say, yeah, that's what I believe, and some say, that's what I believe. That's okay, but at least we know we're at a different starting point. First one, nothing is binding of the Old Testament unless it's specifically repeated in the New Testament. All right, nothing. So in other words, it was written to Israel. It's no longer valid for the church unless it's repeated in the New Testament. Interesting, it's history, but it's not necessarily theology for us. All right, it's Old Testament. We don't have to deal with it. So again, written to Israel alone. And scriptures that they will use for that would be kind of like, well, you know, Christ fulfilled the law and we're dead to the law and those sorts of things, that the old has gone and the new has come. Those would be the kind of references that would say it's old. And we don't need old, we need new, right? It's no longer valid or binding on us. I'll give you one example that people struggle with, all right? And that's the area of the tithe. The tithe is clearly Old Testament. And there are many who hold this, oh, that's Old Testament, we don't have to tithe. Everything I have belongs to Jesus in the New Testament. And I love that as a pastor. Because what pastor wouldn't want 100% tithe? That's what you're saying. It all belongs to Jesus. Great, give it next week in the offering plate. And sometimes we say that to kind of get away from the idea, well, maybe there's still a principle of tithe. And the question is the tithe repeated in the New Testament? All right, this view, unless it's repeated, it's no longer binding. And in some sense, there's no actual place in the New Testament that says, thou shalt tithe. However, there are places in the New Testament where Jesus, in a sense, reiterates the tithe. Remember, he says in Matthew 23, you guys tithe mint and cumin and dill, you tithe all the herbs, but you neglect the weightier matters of the law. And then he says, ready, these you should have done without so he's not necessarily saying thou shalt tithe, but he's saying, yeah, come on, this is what you should be doing. But don't just do this in minutiae and forget the weightier matters of the law. So it kind of like he reinforces that, right? So that's going to be the struggle, right? And I've heard Sabbath day, we don't need to keep the Sabbath, that's Old Testament. We actually were down to 9 commandments, not 10, right? Because the Sabbath, that's Old Testament. We're free from that. Well, are we? All right. So first, unless it's repeated, we don't need to worry about that. The second one, everything is binding of the Old Testament unless it's actually repealed in the New Testament. All right, in that sense, I read it, unless I have something in the New Testament that says we don't have to do that anymore, it's still binding for us. So let's go back to tithe. Is tithe ever repealed in the New Testament? Is Sabbath ever repealed in the New Testament, right? So this view would be saying, unless it's repealed, unless the New Testament says don't worry about that anymore, we don't have to. So what would actually fit in that category? Things like the sacrifices. Tomorrow when you come to church, aren't you glad you don't have to bring a lamb, a bull, a goat, 2 turtle doves, or a piece of bread, depending on your wealth status? That we just come because Jesus has fulfilled all of that? Isn't that's wonderful? That doesn't mean those sacrifices still don't teach us about what Jesus did. The very fact, and it's kind of cool, it's in Leviticus 6 and 7, where these offerings are listed. If you can afford the goat or the bull, bring it. If you can't afford it, God doesn't say, oh, sorry, dude, you're too poor. He says, bring 2 turtle doves. If you can't afford 2 turtle doves, bring just, I translated a piece of bread. It's just a little flour. You know why? Because God's not hungry. It's not like he's up there and saying, oh, man, I just got a bunch of bread today, and I really was so hungry for a goat or a lamb, right? He's not saying that. And so, in a sense, the takeaway is Jesus' sacrifice is valid for everyone. It doesn't matter if you're rich or poor, young or old, male, or that sounds like the New Testament, doesn't it? Jesus comes. So, in that sense, yeah, the sacrifice is circumcision, right? In the Old Testament, in order to be part of the covenant, all males, 8th day, circumcised. New Testament, maybe baptism kind of takes the place of that, but in that sense, it's done away. In fact, remember Acts 15, they argued over, do our Gentile friends, must they be circumcised, and must they keep the holy days, and must they keep the dietary laws? And the New Testament's thinking and saying, no. In Jesus, okay, no blood, nothing strangled, nothing offered to idols. That probably actually goes back to Noah, and it's more universal than going back to Moses, right? That's going to be more covenantal. And so in that sense, that's one way that we can read it. Personally, I don't hold to either of those two, okay? And if you do, that's cool. That's your theology. I'm actually much more comfortable with the third view. And the third view is what we call the moderate view, right? And it simply says this: everything of the Old Testament applies, but none of it applies outside the grid of Jesus. So in other words, we're holding that the Scripture is informative, it's instructive. So it's not like I'm going to do my devotions. Well, I got to start in Matthew to Revelation because Genesis to Malachi doesn't count. Genesis to Malachi counts, but it only counts through the grid of Jesus. All right? So all of it applies, but none of it applies outside of Jesus. That helps me to know, what do I do with the tithe? What do I do with the Sabbath? What do I do with the sacrifices? What do I do with circumcision? Why? Because I'm putting it through the grid of Jesus. All right? Did Jesus fulfill it? Then, in a sense, it's fulfilled in Jesus. Did Jesus, in a sense, not fulfill it because it's more of a moral code? Then it still applies, but it's not up to me to do it on my own. It's because of that sanctifying work of the Spirit. You get the idea? So one of the things you have to kind of decide, and the rest of our conversation will flow out of this. For some of you, it's view 1. For some of you, it's view 2. And I'm actually going to illustrate this with a scholar here in a moment. Or others of you are going to say, yeah, I kind of like it. It all applies. It's still my scripture. Second, can I take this off? It's a little warm for me because I'm just getting excited, right? I have to calm down. Okay. All right. 2 Timothy 3:16, 17, you know that. All scripture is inspired of God and profitable for doctrine, reproof, correction, instruction in righteousness, man of God may be perfect, thoroughly furnished unto all good works. What Paul is actually saying there is scripture at that point is just Old Testament. New Testament wasn't written. So it applies to the New Testament after the New Testament was written, but its primary focus is Paul is saying, hey, as a New Testament believer, our Bible is Old Testament, and it's inspired, and it's instructive for doctrine. We get to know about God, and reproof. We're going to turn, and correction. We're aligned, and instruction. We're able to know how to live, right? So in that sense, I think that third view, it's good, it's helpful, but we have to put it through the grid of Jesus. All right. I don't know. Do you want me to just kind of zip and then at the end take questions, or is it better to just I kind of like pause and just say, we got questions? I don't mind answering them as we go along.
Up to you.
Yeah. Any questions on the three views? You understand the distinctions? Yeah, we're good? We're good? Okay, let's do it. Let's go to the fourth. Yeah, go ahead. What do you got?
Just curious, what do you think on a percentage basis? Or is it denominational?
Oh, I got you, yeah. Certainly denominational, and maybe you've heard of dispensationalism and covenant theology. Those are two big kind of theological categories that denominations tend to surround themselves with. The third view, I actually brought his text with me, is it's a scholar. His name is Kaiser. He's the one that actually does that. What I find difficult as you kind of study the various, whether it's denominations or that idea, is the element of, are they consistent? So they say this, but then all of a sudden they trip and they go into another view, which is why I think the third view is kind of helpful, because it takes the Old Testament serious, but it always reads it through Jesus, right? Which is what I think we need to do. So yeah, there's a whole school of thought under dispensationalism. There's a whole school of thought under covenant theology, and various denominations are represented in each. I don't know the stats, like, it's 50-50 or those kind of things, but certainly these are not isolated ideas. Yeah, I'm going to show you one guy who actually is Assemblies. Well, he's passed away now, and his view is not that third view. All right, and so that's why I'm saying you have the option, you choose, and I'm going to demonstrate his view here in a moment. All right, so yeah, that might help you. Is that good?
Yes.
Any others? Awesome. Let's go to the next slide. All right. So how do I approach the law? I have three options. Now what I need to do is make a distinction. What did the law, and I'm thinking law, Genesis to Deuteronomy, but Old Testament, what was it never supposed to do? And then what was it supposed to do? Because if we misunderstand its primary intent, we're going to misunderstand how to apply it. All right, so let's start with what the law was never meant to do. The first thing is, and this is kind of difficult because many times this is the mindset of New Testament believers, the Old Testament law was never meant to save anyone. Even in Israel, it wasn't do this to be saved. All right, it was always an expression of life in covenant with God. And we like to say, and it's corny, but just laugh with me, or laugh at me, okay. Exodus 19 precedes Exodus 20. Ooh, 19 always comes before 20, right? It's like, why is that so profound? Exodus 19, God calls Israel into covenant relationship. Exodus 20, he gives the commands. Imagine if that were reversed. You got to do this. If you do this, you'll be in covenant. As opposed to, it's an act of grace on his part that he calls Israel in, and he says, now that you're in covenant relationship, this is how you live in covenant relationship. This is how you have good and survival and peace and joy. This is kind of what it means to have God as your God. So it was never meant to save. In fact, think about this. Remember that dude named Abraham? 30 years prior to giving of the law? And it says Abraham believed God and it was reckoned to him as Righteousness. So if the law was necessary, we got to go back and say, God, come on, man. You should have given it to Abraham, not Moses. All right, but no, it was always about grace. But now and it's for us, we make a distinction between justification and sanctification. We're brought into right relationship with God because of the saving work of Jesus. And now that we've been brought into that right relationship because of Jesus, there is a certain lifestyle that follows. We're justified that flows into our sanctification. All right, and in that sense, the law was never meant to save. It was meant to demonstrate what life is like in community with Jesus. But again, think about what Paul says. I don't have it up there. Romans 3:19 and Galatians 3. If the law was able to save, think about this. If the law was able to save, Jesus died in vain. Right? You don't need Jesus if you can do it. And so in that sense, no, the law was never intended to save. It was always, in a sense, intended to say, this is how we live now that we are saved. Oh, by the way, the word Torah, which is the word that we use for the first 5 books, Torah, comes from a Hebrew word, yarah, and yarah means to point. Torah, we use the word law, but probably a better word is instruction. Because we tend to think of law as do's and don'ts. You got to do but it's instruction. This is how you live a happy life. This is how you survive. This is how you get along. And so in that sense, it's pointing us in the right direction. So, and we'll get to that under what it does do. All right, so it was never meant to save. 2, it was never meant to be exhaustive. All right, and we can illustrate it 2 ways. Way 1, think about the Constitution of the United States. Constitution of the United States is really, really small. It's not exhaustive. It points us in the direction of what life should be like. Again, whether we believe in it or not today, that's a different story. But historically, the Constitution, it doesn't have to be exhaustive. It simply points us in the right direction. We value these things, Bill of Rights, right? The government's going to be established this way. And then that's the reason why you have the courts. That's the reason why you have even Congress to make laws that align with. In fact, when politicians take office, whether they do it or not, what do they swear to defend? Constitution, right? Because that's that fundamental idea. And that's not exhaustive. It's saying we really are going to defend the ideas, the principles that are here, and then we have to flesh that out. We have to live that out, right? So in that sense, that's what the Scripture is. Supposedly, there are 613 laws in the Old Testament. All right? And with that, can you imagine if that was exhaustive? That's all you need to know, 613. It's going to be hard enough for me to remember the 10 today, and hopefully you'll be able to remember the 10 after we're done. But how do I remember 613? No, even that. The 613 is the explanation of the 10. The 10 is an explanation of the 2. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and love your neighbor. And the 2 is an explanation of the 1. Treat others like you would want to be treated, and thus fulfill the law and the prophets. Matthew 7:12. Jesus summarizes it in 1. All right, so everything else, in a sense, is going to be explanation. Okay, so how does the law explain? 2 ways, 2 technical terms for you. Apodictic. Apodictic is what we refer to as do's and don'ts. Thou shalt not. So many times the way that the law instructs us is in this idea of the thou shalts and the thou shalt nots, right? So Leviticus 19, verses 9 and 14. We're going to walk all through it, so hopefully you brought your Bibles here. But you shall not steal, nor deal falsely, nor lie to one another. You shall not swear falsely by my name, so to profane. You shall not oppress your neighbor, nor rob him. You shall not curse a death man. It's the thou shalts and the thou shalt nots. And so in a sense, we have the 10, and the 10 is going to be further explained by all these other thou shalts and thou shalt nots. That's apodictic. Casuistic is where they give you an example. It's called case law, right? We even have that in our jurisprudence in the West. Case law says, let me give you an illustration. Let me give you a story, and it's up to you to, in a sense, take the principle and expand it. All right? The law, thou shalt not murder. What does that look like? It looks like this. This is Deuteronomy 15. If you're out in the woods chopping trees, and your colleague is there, and the axe head flies off and kills him, we have a homicide. Right? And then we have to decide, and you read it, case law, did he lie in wait? Did he hate? Was it premeditated? Now we're back to imagine living in a culture that doesn't deal with motives. We're trying to deal with the motives, and if it's unintentional, you go to the city of refuge until the death of the priest, right? So there's always going to be some sort of, restitution for the death of a human being. We'll talk about that later. We create an image and likeness of God. But now I'm sitting there going, oh man, I'm not a logger. I work in a quarry. I don't use an axe, I use a sledgehammer. I wonder if when I'm chopping stone and the sledgehammer flies off, well, it's not an axe head, man, it's a sledgehammer, right? Yeah. Or, I don't work in the forest, I don't work in the quarry, I'm a farmer. And when I bring my crops in, I put it down. Remember the threshing sled? They would have this kind of device, and they would have an ox tied to a center post, and they would just go around, and that's what would grind up the grain, and then they would go, remember, to throw the shaft, and the wind blows the shaft, and all of a sudden my colleague falls, and oh no, he gets run over by the threshing sledge. It's not an axe. It's not a sledgehammer. It's a threshing sledge. Oh, yeah. Accidental killings in the workplace. I don't have to give you every example of accident. Because imagine a law that tried to be exhaustive. I mean, you'd be writing for years and years, generation, because every one of you, because you all, whatever your job has been in life or now, can you imagine what accidental killing would look like in your place of employment compared to the person sitting next to you? How do you write a law that's exhaustive? You don't. You give an example. And then it causes us to try to say, does this fit? All right, if it fits, great. If it doesn't fit, okay, then we're in a different situation. So, never meant to save. It's always by grace. It's never meant to be exhaustive. 613 don't even cut it, right? It begs us to apply. And then lastly, it doesn't just deal with actions. This goes back to what how we started. It deals with our desires, our intents. If I intend to kill my colleague, that's different. That's premeditated. And now I'm going to make it look like an accident. I'm going to weaken the head of the axe, and I'm going to make sure when I'm swinging that you're in line, right? Because this isn't, I've lied, well, you're holy, you're on the front, you're the only one ready to go, all right? So we're going to do this, and it's just like, wow, no. But if we're just working together, oh my goodness, my dear friend, what's going on? You get the idea, so intense. So, and by the way, what's the 10th commandment? Thou shalt not covet. It's all about intent. The other ones are about what we're doing, but the last one, God actually addresses desire. He actually addresses intent. So in that sense, even so, whether I look at the accidental killing and what's the motivation behind that, or whether I actually look at the 10 and I realize that there's one of them that deals with that, we're still realizing, oh, by the way, let's do this real quick. We're putting it through the grid of the New Testament. Remember a guy named Jesus? Yeah. Matthew 5. What we call the antithetical statements in the Sermon on the Mount. You ever heard it said, thou shalt not murder, but I say unto you, everyone who, anger, name-calling, vindictive, raka, fool, empty head, stupid, right? As long as you do it in a foreign language, it's okay. Testadul, all right? And then that's it. No. What's Jesus saying? He's saying when God says no murder, he's really saying be careful of the desires, the intents, the motivations that are behind that. If you don't catch it while it's motive, too often it becomes deed. All right, so even Jesus gives us that grid that it's not just in the thing that we do, but in a sense it speaks to our desires, our intents, and our motives. And he actually re-articulates the law in Matthew 5 so beautifully with that, right? He does it in truth-telling. He does it in relationships. He does it in our gifts and our offerings before the Lord. He moves from deed to desire, right, in every one of those. And so I think that really, really helps us. Okay, so what the law does not do. Let's go to the next one. So what does it actually do then? All right, if it doesn't do all this stuff, what does it actually do? The first thing is it reveals our sin. No better thing than to read the law as a mirror to see who we really are. All right, now remember our dear friend Paul, Romans 7:7. He says, I never knew coveting, which is an interesting thought, right? How can he say he's a Pharisee? I never knew coveting. Until I read, thou shalt not covet. And then all of a sudden, it produces me coveting of all kinds, right? Why? Because all of a sudden, he's confronted with what coveting is about. He's confronted with the idea that wrongful desire, or desire in a sense for a wrong object, becomes something that in a sense makes us guilty before God. So in that sense, he argues at one sense, I never knew sin until the law came along, and then all of a sudden the law, it just revealed it all to me, right? It excited the sin nature. It did those kind of things, and it was just like, yeah, I never knew sin until the law said, thou shalt not covet. Then it produced in me coveting of all kinds. Romans 7 is that passage where Paul says, the things I don't want to do, I do. Things I do want to do, I don't do, right? I'm wretched. I'm torn. And why? It's the law. It's the law that's pointing that stuff out to me. We're gonna see as we look through the law, right? You guys know what OSHA is?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, OSHA. Oh, yeah. And for some of you, you love OSHA. And for some of you, it's like, oh, man, OSHA's keeping me from being able to make money, right? A lot of what OSHA deals with is really Old Testament holiness. Right? If you're you work in the street and you dig a hole for whatever reason, right? You're running gas lines, water lines, electric lines, and you're going to leave for the day, and the hole is open. You have to put that steel plate over it. You have to put the cones around it. The Old Testament says you don't dig a pit and leave it uncovered because someone's going to come and fall into it. OSHA thinks it's a brand new idea. No, it's as old as Moses, right? That in that sense, it's just like it's telling us this is what you do because we're living in community, and because I care for my neighbor, this is one way I care for my neighbor. How many of you have a deck, front yard, backyard, or a porch? How many of it is it's a little bit off the ground? And if it's off the ground, how many of you have some sort of a railing? That's I know it's the codes for you to build your deck or your porch, but it's as old as Moses. If you in the ancient Near Eastern world, they entertained on a flat roof, right? And you needed to build a parapet. You needed to build a railing. Why? So that your neighbor doesn't fall off. You're protecting. You're caring. Right? So again, we have a lot of these new things. They're not new. This is what it looks like to live in a culture that understands good and evil. Imagine a culture that doesn't understand good and evil, which is where we're going, right? As a culture, not today. All right. Yeah. It points us to Jesus, right? Galatians 3:24 calls the law our tutor that leads us to Christ. Now, the problem is with the word tutor. When we hear the word tutor, we tend to think of someone struggling to understand something, math, English, history. So you get a tutor that sits alongside and assists them in the learning. That's our contemporary understanding of tutor. Tutor in New Testament times didn't really have that. So I don't know a better translation, so I'm not complaining about the translation. I'm just saying we have to get back to what it originally was intended. The tutor was the household servant who ensured every day, maybe nanny would be a better word, right? The household servant, the nanny, who ensured that the child got up, the tutor was responsible to walk them through the town to get them to the teacher for the day. And then it was the tutor who took them from the teacher and walked them back to the house. All right? So in that sense, when Paul says the law was the tutor, the law was the one that brought us to Jesus. Mm-hmm. So how do I understand what the sacrifice of Jesus? Well, the law says this is what a sacrifice looks like. How does a sinful person come into the presence of God? Well, the law says, and it brings me to Jesus. How do I know what living a life that's pleasing to God? Well, the law brings me to Jesus. And so in that sense, that's why I like that third one. All of it applies, but none of it applies outside the grid of Jesus, because the tutor is bringing me to Jesus. The tutor has helped me to understand, as a follower of Jesus, this is what truth-telling looks like. This is what relationship building looks like. This is what time management looks like. This is what, honoring God looks like. It's bringing me to that place. All right? And so in that sense, it points to Christ. It's the tutor that brings us to Jesus and becomes this really significant. All right. It informs us of righteousness. This is kind of interesting. Again, we go to our dear friend, the Apostle Paul. How many times you read, like, we're not under the law, we're under grace. Hallelujah. We're not under law, we're under grace. And I believe that, right? We're not under law, we're under grace. This is awesome. If we're not under law, and Ephesians 2, he himself is our peace. He broke down the barrier. He nullified the commandments. He brought us as one new person into Jesus. Awesome. So Paul, then, why are you in Ephesians chapter 6 saying, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is the first commandment with promise? Hold on, Paul. Hold on. Jesus says, no law, but now you're quoting law as though we're still under it. Yeah. No law in the sense that it's at all, because he's dealing with individuals who have a warped view of law, that somehow keeping of the law is going to save. And Paul says, no, it's that tutor. We're not under it, but yet it's still instructive. Yeah. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is the first commandment with promise. He has no problem quoting law. Even in 1 Corinthians 9, the workman's worthy of his wage. You don't muzzle the ox that treads the corn. It's just like, and then Paul makes a weird statement there. He says, God wasn't interested in oxen, was he? Well, yeah, he was, Paul, because he's actually said it. What we're really hearing Paul say is, God wasn't only interested in oxen, was he? Yeah, you're right, Paul. How we treat animals, it becomes, right, casuistic, becomes the case of how we treat people. If you don't muzzle the ox because the ox is worthy of his wage, you don't muzzle people. Just wage for a just day's work. That's just a God-given understanding. Imagine living in a culture that doesn't understand a just day's wage for a just day's work. Familiar with quiet quitting and quiet firing? Or you're following that in the news, right? It's just, yeah. Why? Because we don't understand, right? Because we have in a sense, wandered so far from this stuff. Okay. It reveals the holiness of God and the holy expectations for the people of God. I'm going to develop this theme here in a little bit more. But let's go to Exodus 20. Then God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, therefore. All right, because of who God is, he's able to give us instruction. He's able to show us what holiness looks like. And you can see this over and over again. Exodus 20, Deuteronomy 4, Leviticus 11. And what we actually say is that in the ancient Near Eastern world, the law actually said more about the lawgiver than the governed. So we have Moses' law. There's also, you can research this sometime, a guy named Hammurabi. Hammurabi was another ancient Near Eastern kind of lawgiver. And it's very interesting to compare them. I'll come back and mention him here in a little bit with his understanding between property and people. But when we read the law, whether it's the law of Moses, that's a reflection of God, or the law of Hammurabi, which is a reflection of Hammurabi, we're really finding out more about the lawgiver. Their morality, their understanding, their sense of justice, right and wrong, than we are about the people that they're trying to govern. So isn't that interesting? When I read the law, it's not about like me. It is going to be application to me, but it's really about, this is like God. God cares about people. God cares about lost property. God cares about, right? And so it's a reflection of who God is. Shows the value and power of grace by showing the seriousness of sin. Okay. Guy named King David. Greatest king of Israel. And yet, murderer and adulterer. He should have been stoned twice. Now, that's not possible, but kill him. Okay, bring him back up. Kill him again, right? But in a sense, the law says it, which means what? It means how gracious God is. It tells us about the power of repentance. Paul would have never known coveting. So the law said, thou shalt not covet, and producing me coveting of all kinds. And then the grace of God comes. And the grace of God undoes all of that, right? So when we're looking in that mirror of the law and we see our own sinful state, what we're really seeing is the grace of God. We're seeing the mercy of God, right? Because we all should be killed, right? We'll talk about that here in a moment. All right. Shows us the practical side of holiness. I already kind of illustrated that at one point. Let me see if I can find this one real quick. I like to... The college is right down the road from Valley Forge National Park, right? Which is why it's called Valley Forge. You guys remember Valley Forge National Park, a guy named George Washington, right? No battles were actually fought there, right? So it's not like Gettysburg. There was no battles. He wintered there, and then he goes up, crosses Washington, crossing the Delaware, Christmas Day, comes down to Trenton, New Jersey, Germans. You got your American history. Okay. And yet, though no battle was fought there, we have so many soldiers who died there. And you know why they died? Because they didn't follow the law. They died mostly of dysentery. Right? They're and even George Washington understood, guys, you got to go over there, right? And it was so cold, and they were so, in a sense, impoverished. They would just right outside the little log cabins and then back. And so many died from sicknesses, from dysentery, even though no battle was there. So then read this. And this is one of those things, like you scratch your head, like this is actually in the text? Yeah, this is God. You shall have a place outside the camp and go there. Why am I going outside the camp? Thank you for asking. Let's keep reading. And you shall have a spade, a shovel among your tools. And it shall be when you sit down, you shall dig with it and shall turn to cover up your excrement. What's the law teaching us? How to build a latrine. Anybody involved with Royal Rangers? You guys know Royal Rangers? Yeah. One of the first things you learn is how to dig a latrine, boy. All right, get that shovel, get out there. And it's like, why do we have to learn how to dig a latrine? Because it's biblical. All right? Because what you don't want to do is create an environment that's going to cause disease to spread. And then look at the rationale. Very next verse. Since the Lord your God walks in the midst of your camp, to deliver you, to defeat your enemies before you. Therefore, your camp must be holy. He doesn't want to see anything indecent among you, or he will turn away from you. Like the law is concerned with sanitary practices. Why? Because God's walking among us. And he's a holy God. He doesn't want to see the indecent thing, right? It's weird, but it's just like, we're going to preach that next Sunday, all right? Bring your shovels to church, friends. We're all going to go out. We're going to learn how to do this. It's the practical side of holiness. We tend to think of holiness as this real ethereal thing, right? It's like mystical, like, ooh, I'm holy because, I don't know, I'm just holy. No, holy is like, if I burn down your field, I have to pay you. Right? If I see your donkey walking down the street and I know who it belongs to, I get it and return it to you. And if I don't, I take care of it until you come looking for it. I don't know if any of you have neighbors with donkeys, but you probably all have neighbors with dogs and cats. You see your neighbor's dog run, oh, that stupid Fido. There he goes again. Law says, go and bring him in, feed him, take care of him until. That's what the law says. It's so very, very practical, right? We already talked about handrails. We talked about covering. We talked about orange cones and yellow tape. That's holy. That's practical. God's interested because this is the way we take care of one another. Does that make sense, right? Practical side of holiness. And then, last one. When compared to other ancient Near Eastern laws, it shows that God values humans over property. Now we're back to our dear friend, Mr. Hammurabi. This is so interesting. When you compare Hammurabi's code with the Mosaic Code, right? Hammurabi has capital punishment, right? Taking someone's life for crimes against property. The Mosaic Code has no capital crime with sins against property, only against people. So again, this idea that it's showing us that, and I'm not saying God doesn't care about property because he has a lot to say about property, but what he's saying is property doesn't mean that you have to die. Property means you pay it back, you put a 20% surcharge on that, right? That's your punishment, or sometimes it's double. But there's repayment, but there's not the taking of the life. Hammurabi, oh yeah, taking of the life. Hammurabi will be involved with the mutilation of the body, right? You cut off the hand of the thief, that kind of stuff. In biblical times, no. It's just sins against people because you're actually killing God in effigy. All right, remember our dear friend Noah, he comes off the ark, because I've given you every green thing, so I've given you every living thing, but don't eat the blood. Any man who sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed, for in the image of God he created them. So capital punishment is God's method to say, dude, you're killing God in effigy. This is the image of God. That's the reason why it's so serious. Stealing the donkey, don't. If you do, you're going to owe 2 donkeys. It's stupid, but it's not going to cost you your life. All right, it's just not a good exercise in finances. So does that make sense to you? And so again, we have that comparison, and so we're not turned off by Hammurabi. In fact, we like Hammurabi because we're able to compare. All right, we show how much better, if you will, the Mosaic law is than that. Okay, we'll pause again. Questions, what it doesn't do and what it does do. Thoughts, comments? We're good. Yeah, go ahead. What do you got?
When did Hammurabi live?
Yeah, he lived a little bit prior to Moses. He actually precedes Moses, which is interesting. We have Hammurabi's Code. We have the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is like another flood story, and then a creation story that predate the biblical story. And people who are anti-Bible say, see, the Bible didn't come up with anything new. They just borrowed. We would argue, no. What really happens is, if we believe the story as explained to us in Scripture, if you remember, I guess we can start with Noah. Well, we can start with Adam. Adam knows God. Cain and Abel knows God. They disobey. I'm not saying that they don't understand it, but the knowledge of God goes, and I'm going to talk about this in a moment. The law is really nothing more, or the commandments is nothing more than, in a sense, the making of the conscience concrete. We'll talk about that in a moment. They all understood good and evil, but it becomes a little bit distorted because of their worldview, which is why God needs to give the Mosaic prescription. So even though he predates it, it's interesting that he has it inverted, property over people. Moses comes along and says, people over property. So yeah, good question.
And obviously, is that what the Muslims follow?
No. The Muslims are going to be post-Jesus. They're an Abrahamic religion. They're going to go back to Abraham, but their understanding of law is going to be written out of Muhammad, not out of Hammurabi. Yeah, Muhammad is he's their prophet, and he has a further description with two different guys. Yeah. Good question, though. That's excellent. Are you ready? We're going to take a break. What time? So I'll just keep going until...
Well, we'll do it 10?
10.
You want to go 10? Okay, so let's do the next one. Let's go to the next one. The basis of the law is the character of God. All right. Think about what we're saying, right? That the law is good and holy because it's really reflecting God. Okay, and we can go through some of this. God is holy, and now I'm going to try to define holy for us so that we kind of get what's going on. Oh, let's go real quick just to read this. The Leviticus 11 is probably a good one, 44 to 45. I am the Lord your God. Consecrate yourselves therefore and be holy, for I am holy. You shall not make yourselves unclean with any of the swarming things, for I am the Lord who brought you out of Egypt to be your God. Thus you shall be holy, for I am holy. And then when we deal with the Levitical code, holiness code, we'll see that over and over and over again. The word holy in the Old Testament has two connotations. When we think of holy, we automatically go to moral, right? So holy means that we're moral people. Yes, but we shouldn't start there. What we really need to do is to start with the true understanding of holy. The word is kadosh in Hebrew. Holy or kadosh really means set apart. All right. What makes something holy is that it's distinct. It's unique. So think back in Genesis 1, right? 1 and 2. We have the creation, day 1, light and darkness, day 2, day 3, day 4, day 7. He set it apart as holy. So I got 6 days where we're working, and one day is different. That one different day is holy because it's set apart for a unique purpose. God is the ultimate Holy One. In fact, it's Isaiah's favorite term, the Holy One of Israel, meaning that he's in a category all by himself. He's distinct. He's unique. He's separate from creation. There is no one like him. He is holy. He's unique. Here's the weird one, right? Because we think moral. In the old kadosh. In the Old Testament, they used that term to refer to temple prostitutes. Like, that's the most unholy thing we can think of, right? In the pagan religions, they would have male and female prostitutes as part of their pagan religion. We're saying that's not holy. It's holy. Why? Because they're set apart from just the common interactions with people, and they're dedicated in service to their God. All right, so in that sense, it's that set apart and dedicated to that they can actually use the term for that. What makes us think moral is because this Holy One of Israel, this unique one, happens to also be the epitome of morality. So since we're dedicated to the Holy One of Israel, we reflect his character. His character is above reproach. Therefore, everything else flows out of that idea that we are to be above reproach because he is. Does that make sense to you? So it's this idea that, yes, we think morality, but we don't start there. It's actually this idea of God is holy. Okay. Read a book not too long ago on ethics, and it was interesting. It was from a secular perspective, but they were trying to answer the question: where does our sense of morality come from? All right, and they were actually debating this idea comes from God, and we can't really go there. And here was their argument, right? They had a twofold argument. See if you can follow. Either ethics or morality as given in Scripture is totally arbitrary because God just decided stealing is bad and non-stealing is good. But it's arbitrary. He had no reason to come up with that. It's purely an arbitrary code that he just decided to do that. Or they say that no, there must be another element that God referenced that he recognized, oh, stealing is bad and non-stealing is good. So either he made it up, and there's no rhyme or reason to it, or he discovered it somewhere else. And if he discovered it somewhere else, then what is that somewhere else? And so they're arguing that the God argument seems to be problematic because of it. And as I'm reading, I'm going like, did you ever read the Old Testament? Because what the Old Testament says is not that it's arbitrary and not that it was outside of God, but it's a reflection of God. God doesn't have to look anywhere but within to determine what is holy, because God is holy, right? So he's moral, and he's good, and he's righteous. And so in a sense, it's not arbitrary, nor is it external. Everything in here, which is why we should be reading it, everything in here is just a reflection of God. God cares about property rights. God cares about people. God cares about lost donkeys. God cares about latrines because he cares about dysentery, because he cares about the physical well-being of people living in community. And it's just a reflection of that. Does that make sense? All right, so we don't have to go either of those things. It's just that idea that the law is holy because God is holy and God has given holiness to us. Hence, you shall be holy, for I am holy, is what God says. Deuteronomy 14:2, you are to be a holy people to the Lord. We already read the Leviticus 11 passage, and we're going to read it in Leviticus 18. I'm just going to overwhelm you. Ready? 18:2, 4, 5, 6, 21, 30. Then chapter 19, 2, 4, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 25, 28, 30, 31, 34, 37. And that's not even a complete list. It goes over and over. Be holy, for I am the Lord your God. For I am the Lord your God. For I am the Lord your God. Why do I do this? Because I am the Lord your God. Why do I do this? Because I'm the Lord your God. He's just drilling it down. We do it because we are reflecting God. Now, here's the coolest part. Let's jump New Testament. Be holy, for I am holy. Matthew, that sounds real similar to something he had Jesus say in the Sermon on the Mount. But Matthew interprets it, be ye perfect, as I am perfect. Not moral perfection, but complete. Fulfilling the desire for which God made you. Luke, his Sermon on the Plain, be ye merciful, for I am merciful. Peter, 1 Peter 1, actually quotes, be ye holy. So what are our New Testament writers doing? They're saying, what does it mean to be holy? Well, for Matthew, it means being complete. For Luke, it means, well, we're reflecting God, and God's a merciful God, and we ought to be a merciful God. And for Peter, he's just going to simply keep that. We're holy. We're a holy priesthood, nation set apart to God. So the beautiful aspect to it is God is telling us that we are to reflect him, and part of who he is has to do with completeness. Part of who he is deals with mercy. Part of who he is deals with this idea of holiness or separateness. You get the idea? So that idea that the law is a reflection of God, and when we live not under the legality of it, don't go away with that. When we live under the freedom of it, we recognize that our behavior and our action is actually reflecting the character and the goodness of God. All right. Since law reflects the holiness of God, and since God is unchanging in character, then can we suggest that this law still reflects the holiness of God? But back to, remember my logic? I don't know if you're following, but we got to go back to, it all applies unless repealed. None of it applies unless repeated. Or it all applies, but none of it applies outside the grid of Jesus. And I'm going to suggest it all applies, but none of it applies outside the grid of Jesus. So what do I get of the holiness of God and the mercy of God and the beauty of God? I got to see through that grid of Jesus, who he is, what he's done, and what he's trying to work in our life. Is that making sense? Are you following that, right? So in that sense, it's really, really good. All right, questions before we take our break? Am I going too fast? Am I going too slow? It's following. You're getting it, right? You're seeing my logic. A little weird, but you're getting it. Directions?
Shovels are in the shed.
There you go. There you go.
Take 5.
There's water and coffee over there. Some snacks. Somebody suggested it.
Yeah, I'm sure. I'm sure. I went to CBC.
I'm trying to type it all down.
We saw him in Nick.
I know the name.
He was a good little fella.
That's my cousin. He's so
He's perfect.
have a baby.
He's got a good soul.
They kept looking in NICUs. Kept looking in NICUs.
So that was the same Snyder was prepping me to go.
Oh, good. So yeah.
That's our yard. When I started cleaning my house,
Did she tell you about her neighbor?
it was all clear.
She got induced. She goes, I can't even induce to anyone.
Oh boy, really raining.
Had the infamous back labor. She's a trooper, you know. She's a sweetheart. Water coming down?
It's really coming down bad. Yeah.
Oh boy. Well, yeah.
I remember there was supposed to be a couple days this week. I think
Is that right?
that's the way I feel. The rain does that, right?
Yes. Get up, you're like,
Yeah, sitting too long, that's what I'm bad. My knees and my back.
Come on, legs. Work.
That's it. That's it.
She delivered on.
that's one benefit of having a cat. You get to bend over and stretch.
Oh, there you go.
Yes.
You're doing it right. Yeah.
An excuse. Thursday when I was settling down, I came.
I read about it.
What culture was he?
He would have been ancient Near Eastern culture. Well, Pacific is he's a strange one. He's really which means, and that's kind of what it is. There is still confidence, even among the non-Israelites, and Abraham recognized that he served the Son of God. Remember, God actually speaks to Noah. Noah knew that God was, the son knew, everyone knew that he was You're always right. I have no idea what you're talking about, but I can't imagine you being wrong. The Ghost? The Ruach. Yeah. Yeah.
Hello. So, just one PSA for those that don't know. Ed and Kristen have decided to use us as guinea pigs. They're trying us out for some of their meals for the restaurants here coming up right afterwards at noon. They will provide some food afterwards. So if you don't have plans yet, you're welcome to stick around. Encouraged to, because I hear there's a lot. Yes. So I'm already pre-blessed and giddy with anticipation. So we're going to go ahead and jump back into the teaching here. So thanks so much.
All right. I'll just keep going. You guys feel free to come and go as you need. If you still want to get up and get his coffee or whatever, that's cool. Okay. This, believe it or not, we're still in the introduction, so we're no, but it'll be all right. It'll be all right. It's like an accordion, right? We'll go as big or as small as we need to. What we're trying to do is to lay the foundation of the idea that, because we're not actually looking at anything specific yet, right? We're laying the foundation of the concept of the law. It's a reflection of God. He invites us in. We're New Testament believers. It doesn't mean that you discount it, but if you're going to read it, you got to read it through the grid of Jesus. We're still kind of trying to lay the foundation. Let's go to the next one. Because again, we're trying to answer people who say, no, we don't need to deal with the law. Can we go the next one? There you go. Okay. So how do you respond to individuals? So, well, no, wait. You're talking about the law, but Jesus fulfilled the law, right? And he does. He said, I did not come to destroy, but to fulfill. So we understand. But what is actually meant by Jesus fulfilling the law? And I would suggest several things, right? One, Jesus fulfilled the law by living a perfect life. So you can actually look to Jesus to try to understand, if we lived according to the law, what would it actually look like? All right? And so in his holiness, his morality, his sense of right and wrong, Jesus fulfilled that, so we have a model for us. Second thing is, yes, Jesus fulfilled the law. Remember, All of it applies, but none of it applies outside of Jesus. Why don't I bring a bull, a goat, 2 turtle doves, or a piece of bread to church? Because Jesus has already fulfilled that. In the death, burial, and resurrection, he is going to fulfill all of what we would call the ceremonial aspect of the law or the sacrificial aspect of the law. It still is instructive for us, right? It still helps us to see the necessity of a sacrifice and the content of the sacrifice, and that the sacrifice, in some sense, and Hebrews picks this up, without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sins. The necessity of the death of one for the other, and Jesus does that for everyone. So in that sense, he fulfilled it, and Hebrews is a great place to land there with that. The third idea is Jesus fulfilled the ceremonial aspects of the law and then reinterpreted beyond, in a sense, the externals to the internals. Remember Jesus, we'll go back to something we already mentioned, Jesus with the idea of Sabbath, right? He says two things. It was made for you. You weren't made for it. So we're not enslaved to Sabbath. Sabbath is actually gift, right? It's a gift of God to us. It was made for. And then he says that the Lord is even Lord of the Sabbath. Remember, our Pharisee friends are complaining about the disciples not doing it, right? And he says, man, you got it upside down. That the Lord is Lord even of the Sabbath. So in that sense, he came to show us what it looks like in terms of its fulfillment, in terms of what it looks like. And then we already went to Matthew 5. You've heard it said, it's not just about murder. It's about, anger. It's not just about adultery. It's about lust. It's not just about you're swearing by the right things. Your yes is yes and your no is no. It's not just about, and he reinterprets it to help us to understand that God is just as concerned with the heart as he is, in a sense, with the hands, right? What we do and why we do it. So yeah, Jesus fulfilled the law. It doesn't mean that it's still not instructive for us. He fulfilled it by living it. He fulfilled it by, in a sense, all the sacrifices, and he fulfills it by teaching us, all right, how we are actually supposed to look at it. All right, let's go to the next one. The problem of Paul's statement that we were made to die to the law. All right, so in Romans, wait, the law's gone because we died to the law. Okay, well, let's process it. It's true if, in fact, you're holding to salvation by works. But remember what we said, even Old Testament, it was never a matter of salvation by works. It's always by grace. So Paul, when he speaks to that, he's speaking to Jewish individuals who still think that it's the keeping of the law that in a sense, brings them to a place of honor before God. And he says, no, you're misunderstanding that. It was never supposed to do that. And so he'll come through on that, right? Romans 3:20 and then 3:28 was never the point of the law. Yet Paul can say, and maybe we need to just real quick read this, in Romans chapter 7, after he goes and he says, I never knew coveting except it said, and then it produced coveting, and all this stuff. Notice how he summarizes it in verse 12. So then the law is holy, and the commandment is holy and righteous and good. He's not going through all this and saying, wow, the commandments are bad. We should just forget them. He's still saying it's a reflection of the character of God, and it's still good. It condemns me. I never knew coveting till the law said, and then all of a sudden that's all I'm doing, going around coveting everything. But it's not a bad thing. It's still holy and good and right. And so we see it. But then this next one, I love this, right? Because again, we just sometimes don't read the whole thing. The law is powerless to save. We already talked about it. If we could be saved by the keeping of the law, Jesus died in vain. What an ultimate cosmic non-necessity. Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection, if in fact we could be made right in our own actions. We can't. So in that sense, the law could never do that. And yet Paul says the law is good. But then look what he says in Romans 8, right? And 8:1, probably have it memorized. There's no condemnation. Those who are in Christ Jesus. The law of the Spirit in Christ has set you free from the law of sin and death. Watch this. What the law could not do, weak as it was through the flesh. If it's just up to us, we can't do anything. God did, sending his own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh, and as an offering for sin, I'm reading it through Jesus, and my salvation is in Jesus, he condemned sin in the flesh, and now watch this, so that the requirement of the law might be fulfilled in us, who do not walk according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit. What's he saying? Because of the sacrifice of Jesus and because of this new life being Spirit-empowered and Spirit-led, we're actually able to keep the law. So it's not like the law is gone. It's that the righteous requirements of the law are fulfilled in us. We actually can be good neighbors. We can actually be truth tellers, right? We can actually honor property and honor relationship and honor truth and honor time. Why? Not because of us, but because of that indwelling Holy Spirit of God who leads us and allows us to do it. So in that sense, Paul is saying that the holiness to which the law points to is, in a sense, doable, not in our own strength, but when we walk by the Spirit and yield to the Spirit and live in the Spirit, we're actually able to keep the righteous requirements of the law. So it's really kind of interesting. And then, yes, the sacrifices we don't worry about, but it's still instructive. And yet, there is still that pedagogy, that teaching, that understanding, that illustrating. And we already did this. Christ is, he's become our peace. He has destroyed the commandments that were against us. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is the first commandment with promise. That even the New Testament writers don't just say, it's done. They do it. They deal with it. They give instruction. But again, it's through that grid of Jesus. All right, so kind of a nice way for that. Okay, now the summary of the first big part. Let's go to the next one. So what are we saying to this point? We got another one? There we go. All right. Can we suggest then, after we've laid that big, long foundation, that Jesus simplified the law into either one or two commandments? So if you don't remember anything else, and you say, I heard some dude talk about law. What did he tell you? I got this. Treat others like you want to be treated, and thus fulfill the law and the prophets. I don't remember anything else, but I remember the golden rule is in a sense, the summary. Or, if you got a better memory, you say, I remember this. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. For on these two hang all the law and the prophets. So the summary is going to be loving God, loving others, or the summary is simply going to be treating others like you want to be treated. And Jesus himself does that for us. It's just great. The New Testament reiterates the foundational ideas. Romans 13, a description of love. Paul does that. Galatians 5, flesh and fruit of spirit, kind of encountering one another there. So, it's not like they're going to list them as a 10, but they list parts of it, content of it, because again, it's still a reflection of the holy God. And then we already alluded to this earlier. When Paul says all Scripture, he's thinking Genesis to Malachi. Holy Spirit is thinking Genesis to Revelation, right? Holy Spirit intends more than Paul's aware because he knows that the rest of the canon is coming. When Paul says that, and when the Spirit intends that, what they're really saying to us, you know what? We can read Genesis to Deuteronomy and still get instruction, still get spiritual insight, still allow the Holy Spirit of God to speak to us about what it means to live lives that reflect the character of God and the goodness of God, and actually develop a culture and a society where flourishing is possible. Because it's the moral code of God. Try breaking the moral code of God and see how much we flourish. And I got a quote coming up on that that we'll get to. Okay, so that lays the foundation. Good. We want to do one more thing, one more thing, before we actually begin to look at it in detail. And that is, what I would like to go through is, how do we actually read this stuff? And I'm going to give you two different scholars, so I apologize maybe for the academic side, but we can go to the next one. The first one is going to come from, I already mentioned this guy, Kaiser. It's a book called Toward Old Testament Ethics, and so much of my material is coming from him. But he does a nice summary of how we as New Testament believers should read what we're talking about. Okay, so again, this is that idea of, this would be still the hermeneutics, but he's going to give us a description. So I think I got two slides on that. Let's go to the next one. Okay, and I bolded it because there's a lot of up there, but just kind of follow the bold. Notice what he's saying. When we're reading it, note number one, the law has a loving spirit in the prologue, its introduction, as well as the main body. The course of action ought to be taken because it reflects character, nature, and will of God. What Kaiser's trying to get us to understand is this. It's not God saying, I said do it. If you don't do it, That's not God. God says, you want to flourish? Do you want to know how to have peace in your home, in your society? Do you want to know how you can actually engage in commerce with other people without thinking they're always out to get you? Here's a gift, and it's called the law, and it's called instruction. It comes from love. It doesn't come from anger, all right? And that, by the way, that should be the way we raise children. It's not out of anger. It's out of loving care, instruction, and discipline, because we want them to have a flourishing, effective, successful, happy life. And so we're guiding them. We're not, we're saying, oh, here's a better way, right? And so that comes from God. All right, 2, the Decalogue, fancy word for the 10. The 10 Commandments could have been stated positively as well as negatively, for moral law is always double-sided. Right? So every moral act is not only a refraining, but it's also, in a sense, a doing. So moral laws is double-sided. Let me read the next 2, and then we'll pause and I'll talk about it. Merely omitting or refraining from doing a forbidden thing is not moral. Otherwise, command could be fulfilled by staying in your house and doing nothing. You want to really be holy before Jesus? Just go home and don't do anything. Because then you'll never sin, right? But that's not holy, because holy is not just what I don't do. Holy is what I do. I'm forced to engage, not just simply disengage. For consequently, when an evil is forbidden in one, its opposite good must be practiced, for one can be called obedient. Okay, I have like OCD, right? OCP. Obsessive compulsive person. I'm not, it doesn't negatively impact. And there are some things that I just zero in on. And one of the things I zero in on are tires. And when I'm walking around, you tires?
I'm a tire fanatic. Yeah.
So you're looking, and I so many times I'm walking through the parking lot and I say, oh man, that dude's got a nail in his tire. Did you ever do that? Oh, yeah. You're seeing it, oh man. And now all of a sudden, like, what am I supposed to do? And then I'll look around, is anyone around? Is this your car? You know you got a tire. I did that the other day. I was on my walk, and I was walking through a neighborhood, and there was a car parked in his tire, and then a guy came out from the door. But it was a bunch of row homes. So it's like, I don't know if he was in. I said, is this your car? He said, no. I said, oh. Well, then I'm thinking like, oh, he's thinking I'm going to try to steal it, because I'm asking if it's his, because I'm saying, oh, well, I see a nail in your tire. And I just keep walking. And then when I'm on my walk, you do this as well. When I'm on my walk and you're walking, there's a nail in the road. You better stop and pick that thing up and throw it in the grass, right? Why? Because how would you like to run over and get a nail in your tire? Yep. Yeah, golden rule says. And so all of a sudden, I'm walking. Oh shoot! I'm walking. Oh man! And sometimes, if you ever been around a roofer, you go through a neighborhood that's there's roofing nails all over the place, and now all of a sudden my walk turns into more nail picking than actually walking. Right? In that sense, it's not that. Now, where am I going with that? You have no idea. I'm going somewhere. I don't take out my knife and puncture someone's tire and say, all right? It's not refraining from evil. Well, I've never punctured anyone's tire. Unless I work to preserve so that their tire is not accidentally punctured, I'm not really holy. You get the idea? It's not just what I do, it's in a sense what I have to protect. You get what we're talking about, right? That's why you shovel your driveway or your walk, so that someone doesn't fall. Right? It's like, well, I didn't go out there and trip them. No, but you didn't take the snow away, and they slid, and all of a sudden you're going to be your insurance, right? It's that you get the struggle. So that's what it's talking about. Not merely omitting or refraining. That's not the moral thing. Well, I didn't puncture anyone's tire. No, I got to do the opposite before I can be said to be holy or caring. Or are you getting the idea? So holiness, again, is always two-sided. Okay, go to the next step. Still Kaiser. To reject virtue is to choose vice, thus the absence of positive moral action has the force of rejecting that value. So again, Kaiser's really, he wants to drive home this idea that it's not always what I do, it's in a sense what I neglect to do or fail to do. Remember James, he talks about, to him who knows the right thing and doesn't do it, it is sin. It's the sin of omission, not just the sin of commission, right? And that's really what he's talking about. Command is never fulfilled either by mere refraining to engage or a single act of positive age. Therefore, we not only refrain, but we'll do all that's in our power to contribute to the life and well-being of our neighbor. Olden days, just normal gossip. Gossip goes around about something, you know it's not true, and you don't do anything to stop it. I didn't gossip. I didn't tell the story. No, but you didn't stand up and say, that's not true. You get what he's saying? It's not just I'm not doing it, but it's also I'm stopping. The new world with social media, I'm not on social media. You know why? Because there's no way I can monitor this kind of stuff. It's just like overwhelming because everything is out there. And it's like, can you imagine if you tried to, and don't do this, you'll go nuts. But can you imagine trying to say, that's not true, that's not true, that's not true, that's not true. You would spend your whole life saying that's not true to the stuff that's out there on social media. But you're getting the pressure. You're getting the understanding, right? What does it look like to be holy in that respect? Okay. Command speaks not only to acts and attitudes. Boy, we've been saying this over again. Incentives, enticements, pressures, right? It's motivation. It's not just what I do. And then, since it's easier to state in a fewer words, the negative, and since the negative influences, right, that strong evil intent of the heart, most of the 10 Commandments does that. Can you imagine, again, our freedom and grace is so large, can you imagine, rather than the 10 Commandments, you had all the commandments of the stuff you were supposed to do? And it would go on and on and on and on. Because what? Well, Paul puts it this way in Galatians, against such there's no law. How do you control that? How do you make the fruit of the Spirit? How do you put the legal parameters on that? You can't. How much like love or joy or peace? Against such there's no law. You can't regulate that. You can't regulate the good that we are to do. So what God does in his wisdom, he says, let's just take these 10 categories and put it up as a paradigm to say, if you want to live a good life, this is not going to help. Everything else, in a sense, is explanation beyond that, but he sets that up as the parameter for us. Does that make sense? So that's going to be Kaiser, and again, it's just a good way to read it. Now let's go to the next one. Now we're in Fee and Stewart. You maybe have heard of this book. This is like a little paperback, really popular among Christians, How to Read the Bible for All of Its Worth. It's going to be a hermeneutics book, right? A Bible interpretation book. Fee is the New Testament scholar. Stewart is the Old Testament. And Fee is the AG guy that I was talking to you about. And then Stewart. So let's just look at what they say. Now, all of a sudden, you know why I started with the 3 ways that we read it. All of it applies, none of it applies, all of it applies, except. Because listen to what they do. Do see the Old Testament is fully inspired. So in other words, it's still God's instruction, but it's not necessarily a specific command because they're seeing it as it was for Israel. Do see the Old Testament law as the basis for the Old Covenant and therefore Israel. So in that sense, it's done away because you're not Israel, rather than being binding on us. Now notice, and I bulleted it for you, except we're specifically renewed. They just told you their hermeneutical principle. Remember the 3? Nothing applies unless renewed. Everything applies unless repealed. Everything applies, but nothing applies except. So what are they saying? Nothing applies unless it's been renewed. So again, you can agree or disagree, but they've told you their hermeneutical basis of it, right? So that helps you to do it. Still good stuff. It's about God's justice, love, the high standards, cool. And again, the grace of God becomes so powerful. Don't see the Old Testament law as complete. It's not. It's a paradigm, apodictic, casuistic, right? Those things. Don't expect the law. This next one is good. It's not going to be cited, but it's going to be the foundation of it. And I'm going to explain that in a moment here, the essence of it. Do see it as a generous gift to Israel. I'm going to say it's a generous gift for God to everyone, bringing much blessing when obeyed. Don't see it as a grouping of I love this, arbitrary, annoying regulations limiting people's freedom. He's not saying, ooh, I know how to make your life miserable. That's not what it's about. It's about like, I know how to make life flourish for you. Right? And so God does it. So again, just 2 different ways to look at that, 2 different scholars. And again, it illustrates why that starting point of the 3 lens becomes so significant for you. All right? And you're actually able to do it. All right, let's go to the next one. My premise, the 10 Commandments are nothing more than the codification of conscience. Now, this is where it's going to get really kind of good because what I just read to you from those scholars is just to Israel. And then we're saying, no, this is to Israel and the church. What I'm actually going to argue now, and I'm going to do it through several series, is no. God expects this of everyone on planet Earth. How do I go that God expects this to everyone on planet Earth if it was only given to Israel through a guy named Moses? I'm going to prove that. All right, you ready? Here we go. Number 1. I'm actually giving you the cheat sheet, all right? But this is what you're going to do for homework. No, but here's the answers. Here's the answer. This is the easiest homework you ever had. Here's the cheat sheet. Start in Genesis and read to Exodus 20. All right, because Exodus 20 is the first place the 10 Commandments are listed. Start in Genesis 1, read to Exodus 20. You know what you're going to find? Prior to the law, humans understood the essence of the law. They understood morality. And I'll prove why here in a moment with the next slide. But catch this. The whole idea of Jacob going into the promised land with his wives, and he says, get rid of all the foreign gods, and they bury them under the tree because we're going back to the promised land, and Jehovah is only going to be our God. He understood no other gods, right? When the whole Laban thing, why'd you steal my household gods? Remember the teraphim and Rachel sitting on them, and that whole kind of scenario, and that's the thing that they're going to bury under the tree. No, don't create any images of God. 24:3, swear by the Lord. I shall not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain. You're allowed to swear. Hear me. I'm using swear in a technical sense. Yeah. There's swearing, there's cursing, and then there's vulgar speech. You're allowed to swear, you're allowed to curse. Hold on. Swearing, I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, so help me God. I'm swearing. Don't do that falsely. If you're going to tell the truth, don't do that, because you're saying what? God's my witness. God knows everything. So now, we're not saying take the name of the Lord in vain. We're not saying that's cursing. God curses and blesses Israel. Curse your kneading bowl. So in that sense that we either live under the curse of God or we live under the blessing of God. So that's what I mean by that. I'm not using, vulgar speech is the thing that we really struggle with, right? You shouldn't be using bad words. But the actual essence of the curse or the swear, and in this case, I'm going to swear, but if I'm swearing by the right thing, right? In that sense. Okay. God bless the seventh day, the Sabbath, man, from creation. They cry when their parents die, honoring father and mother. Cain, where's Abel? Am I my brother's keeper? Thou shalt not murder, right? Right? The Genesis 39, Joseph, Potiphar's wife, he knew not to commit adultery. How do you know that? Who taught him that? He don't have the Ten Commandments. Why? I mean, of all people who should have just said, oh, forget this. God sold me off into bondage because of my family. I'm living it up, man. God, here you. He knows. And he knows what? How can I do this thing and sin against God? And it wasn't even written yet. It wasn't recorded. Why thou shalt not steal? Why have you stolen? Getting household gods and that kind of stuff. Thou shalt not bear false witness. Again, Genesis 39. What does Potiphar's wife do? She bears false witness on Joseph. Right? The problems that go with that. And God still honors because he did the right thing, even though she lies. Thou shalt not lie. Bear false witness. And then the Genesis 12 and the 20, that's Pharaoh and Abimelech when they desire Sarah. Right? Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife. And both times God has to intervene because Pharaoh and Abimelech are longing for. Guess what? First of all, the Jews aren't Jews until Judah. Right? You have the Abrahamites or the Israelites, but the Jewish people, it's not till Judah. So in that sense, from Abraham all the way, from Adam and Eve all the way to Moses, they know. And it's not even recorded. And even Pharaoh and Abimelech and Potiphar's wife and everyone else, they know. Now the question is, how do we know they knew? Let's go to the next one. It's so interesting that when you read the Old Testament prophets and God sends, right, Obadiah is to Edom, Jonah is to the Ninevites, Nahum is to the Ninevites, Isaiah and Jeremiah are to the nations. Right? So I kind of give you that. How is it that God holds the nations accountable for the contents of the law if in fact he never gave them the law? Is there something to think about that? Like you're sitting there saying, well, God, that's not fair. This is our big thing. How are people going to be judged if they never had Scripture? They have conscience. And what the law is just the codification of the conscience. Now, follow this. It's going to be a string in terms of our thought process, but we're going to go somewhere. Now we're going there, right? Paul affirms the universal nature of conscience. All right. In Romans 1, Paul's actually going to say that nature has provided enough evidence that a God exists, and the nature of that God, his eternalness, his otherliness, right, that kind of a stuff. And what did humans do? They exchanged the God, right, the creator for the creation. And then they begin to worship things like, animals and serpents and birds and that kind of stuff, which says what? In natural revelation, there is enough, now catch this, there's enough in natural revelation to damn people because they know God exists, but they reject God as he is, and he holds everyone accountable to that. So even though someone has never heard the name of Jesus, they have natural revelation and they know something about God. That's what Paul is arguing. Then he proceeds in Romans 2 to say that we have conscience. And for this, I do want to read so that you're hearing like the actual scripture, right? Not my bad memory of quoting scripture. This is in Romans 2, and he's talking about conscience, and conscience is this, Pinocchio. Jiminy Cricket. Right? Jiminy Cricket is conscience. What makes Pinocchio the puppet, Pinocchio the boy? The internalization of conscience. Right? That's what distinguishes it. That's kind of like the moral of the story. So what Paul is saying is we all have our Jiminy Crickets. Every person on the planet Earth has Jiminy Cricket, has this independent conscience, God-given, that either accuses or excuses because because God has placed it right within us. And so let's go Romans 2. For all who sinned without the law perish without the law. All who sin under the law judged by the law. It's not the hearers but the doers. Watch. For when the Gentiles who do not have the law, they don't have the 10, do instinctively the things of the law. They know. Genesis 1 to Exodus 20. They've got it. They know it. These not having the law are a law unto themselves because they have that conscience, right? In that they show the work of the law written in their hearts, their conscience bearing witness, their thoughts alternately accusing or else defending them on the day when, according to my gospel, God will judge the secrets of men through Christ Jesus. Now, here's the scary part. We live in a world that wants to call good evil and evil good. How do we get there? People have to sin against conscience to get there. They know. It's not like they're saying, well, I don't know, I thought stealing was good. Or I don't know, I thought lying was good. You know that stealing is bad. You know that lying is bad. You know that. And the list goes on and on. They have conscience. Now, what happens to the individual who has the conscience and keeps pushing beyond it? Destruction. And the scriptures will refer to the idea we can sin against conscience, we can harden our heart, our consciences can be seared, we can keep sinning and going against it, saying no, 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 to where we get to the point that we begin to call evil good and good evil. Does that make sense? And that's the world. That's where we're living. So when we look out on the landscape around us, it's not like, man, God, I wish you'd just help people to see good and evil. Oh, no, they know good and evil. This is deliberate sin against, to the point where their conscience becomes so destroyed, they begin to call evil good and good evil. All right, so in a sense, the law is nothing more than conscience being written out. Everyone knows that there is a God, but they're sinning against it. They're worshiping creature rather than creator. Everyone knows it's wrong too, right? And so how do we get to the world that we're in? It's this idea they're going to simply keep pushing past that, right? Which is really rather scary, is it not? Does that make sense? So think about where we're at logically. What are my approaches to law, right? The three methods, right? What doesn't it do? What does it do? Well, what about Jesus? Well, what about Paul? Well, what about the person who's never read the Bible? No, you know what? All the way through, there's knowledge, there's culpability, there's understanding, and so we can't simply say people, we don't give them a pass. And somehow they don't know. No, they know. All right, and now it becomes the searing, the sinning against, the hardening, those kind of things. That becomes really problematic.
So then why do we need the law?
I think what the law does is it simply makes plain conscience. It codifies it. It's going to make sure that there's no question about it. So in that sense, it's just, and remember, now, why do we need all of this? We would hold this as progressive revelation. So think about between Adam and Moses, all of Revelation is personal. It's dreams, visions, theophanies, those kind of things. Moses is the guy who writes it down. And now we are responsible for the written, not just the lived. So in that sense, yeah, it's actually making humanity more culpable. because now there is a stated thing. So think about even in the United States where we want to put this or we don't want to put it on our courthouses. Think about what we're saying as a people if we want to try to remove that. We understand by conscience that everyone should agree to this. This is not like Jewish. This isn't Christian. This is just basic morality. And when we want to remove basic morality, what are we saying? We want to be immoral. So yeah, I think the reason the law is given, it's codifying it. It's just making plain so everyone's on the same page. So we can't debate or argue, well, I don't know, is coveting really that bad? Yeah, thou shalt not covet. And they knew it, but now all of a sudden it's written. It just makes us more culpable. Does that kind of help?
Yeah, I mean, to go from Torah to the Torah to the entire Tanakh. I mean, it seems like we go from, I know you're just dealing with the law, but to go from law to further revelation, you need the foundation of the Torah.
So in that sense, what you're saying that the prophets and the writings are nothing more than further description or understanding of law.
I think they support the law.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, I pointed over here because last time I looked over here, it was Doug, it was Fee and Stewart. Oh boy, yes, you're good. Yeah. Fee and Stewart. Stewart will actually say in that How to Read the Bible for All of Its Worth that the prophets are nothing more than covenant enforcers. That they're simply saying, you know why the good's happening to you? Because you're living in obedience. You know why the bad's happening to you? Because you're living in disobedience. So yeah, I think the further description of the law, the prophets, and the writings, that they become much more the explanation, which was part of our premise here, that Jesus doesn't undo this. He fulfills it. He ratifies it. Even Paul is doing that. So it's part of that progressive revelation. Excellent. Yeah, very good.
It seems to me, though, that in society today, part of the conscience has been seared, but they know it's wrong, but yet they are encouraging other people to accept it and
Yes.
using the tenets of Christianity, like be kind to others, do unto others, be compassionate, love the environment because we're stewards of to the point that it goes off the charts. So it becomes law, and when it becomes law, it's not God's law, but when it becomes law, then now everything's changed.
So you're bringing up two, in my hearing, you're bringing up two really, really good points. The first point, let's go to Romans 1, because this is exactly what you said. Watch this, to verify what you're saying. Romans 1, I'm at the end of the chapter, verse 28. So God turns them over, God turns them over, God turns them over. They know, but they're sinning against. And just as they did not see fit to acknowledge God any longer, God gives them over to a depraved mind to do those things which are not proper, being filled with all unrighteousness. And then he goes through a sin list: wickedness, greed, evil, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, malice, gossip, slanders, haters, insolent, arrogant, arrogant, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient, without understanding, untrusting, unloving. And now watch 32. Although they know the ordinance of God, that those who practice such things are worthy of death, they not only do the same, your point, but also give hearty approval to those who practice them. It's not just I know and I sin, it's like I'm encouraging you to, right? And that, according to Paul, is like one of the test cases of how perverted and demented the modern mind is outside of God, because not only do they do, but they want to give hearty approval to that. So excellent. Point two, yes. They begin, which is why I think this conversation is so critical. Like it seems like, well, we're just talking about good and evil. Everybody knows good and evil. No. What are they doing? They're twisting the terms. They're making love tolerance, but love is never tolerance. Love is intolerant.
Yes.
If you're married, you're intolerant of your spouse loving someone else.
That's right, Daryl.
Right? That love is, that was good. That was needed because we went too deep there, right? No, thank you. Yeah. But you understand that idea? That love is not, and what do? They want to say, if you're loving, you tolerate everything I do. When in fact, come on, do you have children, or have you had children, young children? That's a busy road out there. Yeah. And your little 3-year-old wants to play in the middle of the street. And you're saying you're tolerant. You're saying, oh yeah, hon, go, I love you. Yes, you want to do that, you do that. And what happens? The child's flat. Love says, no, you're going to hurt yourself. They're interpreting love as, you let me do what I want to do even though it hurts me. Love says, I can't let you do what you're going to do because you are going to get hurt. And you're right, they're twisting the vocabulary. Yes. And when we understand that not only are they giving hearty approval to sin, but they're also twisting the vocabulary, and that's the point of the prophet who said, good, evil, evil, good. They're twisting it. They're inverting it. They're turning it upside down. That's when we live in a world that, again, hear this. In one sense, it's like, we spent 3 hours talking about good and evil. Doesn't everyone know the difference between good and evil, for crying out loud? Why did we do it? Because we're living in a world that's not a given anymore. Conscience, they know. They're sinning against it. They're searing it. They're hardening it. And we deal with the aftermath. And that's the world we live in. So you're dead on. Dead on. You want more? I mean, you have more? No, you look like you wanted to say more.
No.
We good?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No. It's just like the enemy is very, very patient.
Oh, yeah.
And this has been going on for centuries. And you can see, and now we're getting to the point where it's black. I mean, for us Christians, it's black and white.
Yeah.
And so we all have to be ready because we're going to be called.
Absolutely. The persecution's coming because if we're living in a world that says good is evil and evil is good, and we're saying good is good and evil is evil, there's going to be a conflict. Yeah. Right? And you see that from society to society, generation to generation, world empire to world empire, that when they so lose their way, there comes a point where there's a day of reckoning, and what is that going to look like? And that's why we just have to be assured that no, good is good and evil is evil. And it's Daniel, I'm sorry, I can only pray to my God. Well, then lion's den for you, buddy. It's Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I'm sorry, there's no other idols. I just can't do it. Well, fiery furnace for you guys. So there comes a day where we have to take a stand for that which is righteous. And there are times when God delivers. I love Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Our God is able. Yeah. But even if not, we will not. Right, so there's that sense where you're right. It's been slowly eating away. Paul says in 2 Corinthians, right, that if Satan appears as the angel of light, we ought not be tricked that his messengers also appear that way. Angels of light. No, dude, he's darkness. Oh yeah, but he comes as the. Don't you love me? Don't you tolerate me? Don't you care for my happiness? Well, according to God, this is not going to make you happy. This is going to end really, really bad, right? But how do you say that? So you're right. There's this twisting that's going on. So that's the world we're in. It's bad. Okay. You ready to actually get to the main point? No. Let's go ahead and walk through each of these codes. Okay, let's go to the next one. I'm going to deal with different portions in the Old Testament. We're going to start with what we know of as the Ten Commandments. It's found in two places, Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5. So in the beginning of the Exodus experience, and then at the end, before they go into the Promised Land, he deals with it. Notice there in the 10, there are 3 positive commands. Remember, we just talked about Kaiser. Most of it is going to be in the negative, thou shalt not. There's actually 3 positives. Positive 1 is, I am the Lord your God who brought you out. Positive number 2 is honor or remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. And then positive number 3 is honor your father and mother. What many scholars are going to do is they're going to take the 3 positives and they're going to use that as a means to categorize the rest. So I am the Lord, right relationships with God. Only one God, no idols, not taking the name of the Lord in vain, right? It's a description of what it means to have one God. Right relations with time is honor the Sabbath day to keep it holy. But when you look at the description of Sabbath, as we'll do, what we find is it's not just about a day a week, but there's a sabbatical year. There are 3 festivals that everyone goes up to 3 times a year. There is the year of Jubilee. That all, in a sense of of creation understands the timing, that there's a time to work and there's a time to rest, there's a time to worship, there's a time to celebrate, right? So right relations with time. It's the shortest way to get there. And then honor your father and mother. How do we live in community, right? And that's going to speak to relations with others. Honoring my father and mother means I don't take someone else's property. It means I don't take someone else's spouse. It means I don't take someone else's reputation. It means I don't desire what someone else has. There is this description of what I don't do in order that I can honor relationships in a positive way. So we can use these three kind of as the paradigm, the plate to look through the rest. And then when you look through the rest of the covenant code in Exodus and the Levitical code in Leviticus 16 and then in Deuteronomy, everything else is just explanation of what does it mean to have a right relationship with God? What does it mean to have a right relationship with time? What does it mean to have a right relationship with others? All right, so that's what we're going to try to do. So let's go to the next one. All right, so let's just walk through the 10 Commandments. We'll use Exodus 20 to do that. And let's see where we're at. So right relations with God means that, and I guess, I don't know, you want me to read it? I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. That's the positive. No other gods, not make for yourself an idol, likeness, heaven above, earth beneath. Worship them, serve them. I'm your God, jealous, visiting iniquity of fathers, third, fourth generations. Don't take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not leave him unpunished who takes his name in vain. Notice those three commands, in a sense, that flow out of I am the Lord your God, speaks to internal worship. I am the Lord. Hence atheism is wrong, because that argues that there is no God. No form. You can't take the God of the universe and somehow characterize him as, you know this from Aaron and the Egyptians. We'll put him in the form of a bull. Because a bull is strong and a bull is productive and a bull is, and so they make this, remember the golden calf, the golden bull, and this is your God who brought you out of, it's like, no, not really. So no idolatry. And I am the Lord, you shall have no other gods. Right? So polytheism all of a sudden just becomes, no. So think about, we live in a world filled with idolatry, filled with atheistic, naturalism, materialism, scientism, all atheistic, Marxism, all atheistic. Polytheism, that we also live in a world filled with New Age spirituality, where we have our spirit guides. And does your spirit guide you in the crystals and the metals and the gems? And it's just like, no, one God. One God, not many, right? So we live in a world that does that. Right relations with time, the Sabbath day, remember the Sabbath day, to keep it holy, right? It's unique, it's different. Remember what we talked about already with holy. Holy means set aside from the normal and dedicated, in a sense, to the special. So and we go from Saturday, which is the original Sabbath, to Sunday, which is actually an apologetic for the resurrection of Jesus. What would make Jewish people change their Sabbath from seventh day to first day unless something really big happened? It's the resurrection of Jesus. That's why we meet on the first day of the week, right? Not the seventh day. Unless you're Seventh-day Adventist, then you meet on the seventh day. But otherwise, we meet on the first day. So what we're saying is it's different. Now, if some of you, because you work swing shift or something, you have to work on Sunday, you take another day that's different. That I don't do the normal thing. I set it aside for rest and renewal and worship and just memory. And if nothing else, we'll talk about this here, lordship issues, right? Not all, I'll just confess all my sins to you. Well, not all, but just a few of them. All right. I already confessed my OCD. Let me confess my. I'm a control freak. Any control freaks among us? No one will admit to it. I know. So I will ask it this way: are you one of those wise individuals that you know, if only people would listen to your advice, they would have a much better way to live? Anyone like that? Control freaks. Okay, right? We know how to run the world. We know what's good for people. If people would just listen to us, man, they wouldn't go astray. One day a week, we got to let it go. That's the point of Sabbath. One day a week. It's, oh, God, oh, okay. You're in charge. It forces us to remember He's Lord. It forces us to stop trying to control everything. It's just like, come on, Sabbath is the principle. It's one day a week, but it also, I like to use, and I know it's not, I get where we're living in latitude, longitude, I get it. 8:16. Generally speaking, we need 8 hours of sleep and 16 hours of wake. generally speaking, right? I deal with college students that need 9 to 10 and get like 3 or 4. Right? Oh, but they can do it, in class, but they can do it. Yeah, okay. That's a hazard of the job, right? All right. So we 8 to 16, 6 to 1, 6 years to 1 year, sabbatical year. 48th year is your normal year, 49th year is your more sabbatical year, 50th is the year of Jubilee, the year of release, right? Remember that, Old Testament, where God, in a sense, keeps saying, let it go. Show me that you know that it's mine, not yours. You actually have to fall asleep at night and say, okay, God, you got it for the next 8 hours. I'll pick it up in the morning. You don't really pick it up in the morning, but you feel like you pick it up in the morning, right? But it's this idea of like, I got to turn it over. Sleep is an act of lordship and faith that God will protect you. And your children's past. Now I lay me down to sleep. Pray the. If I. What are you praying? You're praying, God, you got this. If in the middle of the night you take me, guess what? That's even better. I would like to die in my sleep, right? That'd be okay, never mind. Now here's the cool part. Ready? When you compare, this is the only thing in the 10 Commandments that are different. In Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5, there's 2 different rationales for Sabbath. The first one is because I redeemed you out of Israel. And the first one is because I've created everything. Deuteronomy is because I redeemed you out of Israel. Why does God change up the rationales for this command? I think it's really, really critical. This is God. Ready? Sabbath day. Why do I have to let it go 1 day a week? God, to dipple. I created it all. I own it. Let it go. Okay. Why else do I have to let it go 1 day a week? God, to dipple. Because I've redeemed it all. I brought you out of the land of Egypt, dude. It's not yours. It's mine. You got to let it go. Because he's the creator and because he's the redeemer, he asks us at least 1 day a week to remind ourselves of that we just let it go. Does that make sense? And he changes it up. He could have just did the creation motif. He could have just done the redemption motif. He does both. He owns it because he's created it. And it's almost like this. He created it and then kind of sin destroys it. And so then he brings it back into his ownership through his redemption. Right? He's buying back what was already his. And he said, because it's twice bought, you just got to let it go. And there's something beautiful about that, right? Okay. Becomes our work, rest, festivals with the other. Right relations with others. Sanctity of family, honoring your father and mother. Paul will use this. It's the first with promise. Comes universal, the sanctity of life. Thou shalt not murder. We already talked about the law speaks to intent. So what's the difference between murder and homicide? Remember the axe head? So am I murdering if there's an accidental killing in the workplace? No, that's unintentional. This is what you do there. So that one commandment sets the stage for all those other commandments for the sanctity of life. Notice it's thou shalt not murder, not thou shalt not kill, because what do you do for the murderer? You kill, right? So it's not that no killing, it's no murdering, and you if it were killing, it would be that we kill the killers, but it's murdering, and so in a sense, capital punishment comes under that, right? So basically what we're saying is that there are legitimate times to kill. Capital punishment is one of them, and whatever that looks like in our culture, I'm not going to go down that road. I understand it's a hotbed. From a biblical standpoint, let's go back to Noah even, not even Moses. Any man who sheds man's blood by man, he's empowering the state, by man his blood shall be shed. Why? Because you destroyed God in effigy. For in the image of God, he created them. So in that sense, capital crime is, you're allowed to kill for food? As I've given you every green thing, so I've given you every living thing, Noah. And then what the law just does is just tells you what kind of food you should like and what kind of food you shouldn't like. It's so funny, right? I had relatives that were Sabbatarians, right? So like my Uncle Herb and his sisters and stuff, they wouldn't eat pork products. They wouldn't eat shellfish. They actually did rest all day on Saturday and they went to church all day on Sunday, right? So they were very, very legalistic and Sabbatarian. And my one uncle, he's Uncle Herb, I did his funeral. It's funny because he was anti-pork and shellfish and that kind of stuff. And yet it was so funny because one of his favorite expressions expressions was "what the ham." Right? He wouldn't curse, right, or use vulgar language, but he said "what the ham." Well, it was funny because to Uncle Herb, ham is bad, right? It's kind of fun, right? So if you don't eat ham, you can say "what the ham." Okay. Christian version. Where am I going with that? Oh, to this day, if you like ham, pork products, and if you like your shrimp, lobster, crabs, shellfish, mussels, probably most of you still don't eat vultures. True? Sure. And probably most, though I do know some people do this, and it's okay if you do, because we're that part of the law through Jesus, most don't eat roadkill. Right? So it's interesting with the dietary laws that there are some that, some laws that we say, hey, you know, I like shrimp, but I'm not going to eat the vulture. Right? Because it's the unclean bird. And so in that sense, how do we process that, right? And I use roadkill because anything that dies on its own, there's a specific law on that, right? And so we'll kind of come back to that. So the whole idea of sanctity of life. Sanctity of marriage, we have the adultery issue, the fornication issue, the whole virgin thing that the law will talk about. What do you do with the war bride? There's all those things. Deuteronomy 24 talks about the context of divorce. Is there ever a legitimate time for a marriage to end, right? And he'll talk about those sorts of things. We don't. So again, we're doing it through the grid of Jesus. Through the grid of Jesus, Matthew 19, God's intent, loving, lifelong, monogamous, heterosexual marriage. That's his intent. Loving, lifelong, monogamous, heterosexual marriage. Then, because of the hardness of men's hearts, there are some things, because life happens, sin happens, there are some things he allows but he regulates. Divorce, he allows it but he regulates it. Celibacy, it's not as ideal, but he allows it and regulates it. And there are some things that he always forbids. And this is the debated one, right? And I'm going to go through and I'll try to show you some of this with the law. Homosexuality is never allowed. And it's interesting. I teach college, so I stumble over words because I understand words constantly change. I'll use the biblical expression, then we'll talk about the common words. A man cannot wear women's clothing and a woman cannot wear men's clothing. That's how it reads, right? Our struggle today is we used to call that being a transvestite. But today, transvestite, cross-gender, or cross-dresser, and transgender actually refer to three kind of different things. Mm-hmm. One's more done in entertainment, one is done more like in private for whatever, and another is more of a public kind of description of a supposed self. So it's really weird where before we would just use the word transvestite or cross-dresser. In our culture, we have different words that each have like a little bit different thing. But here's the interesting thing. As old as Moses, he says, don't confuse the genders. Whatever that looks like, right? And so we can't get back and get into the psychology of what's going on. But they understood when people were trying to confuse the genders, men wearing women's clothes or women's wearing men's clothes. Never allowed, right? Homosexuality, being whatever, appearing as though you're not. You don't approach an animal and have sex with it. We'll talk about this later, right? We'll give you the scriptures. If transgenderism is possible, then transspeciesism is possible. If I am as I say I am, so let's say I'm a man and I say I'm a woman, if that is a reality, then there's no reason to say that I'm not a cat. And so if I want relations with a cat, you can't tell me I'm wrong because I'm a cat. I identify as a cat. That's why the scripture says you don't approach an animal to mate with it. Why? You're crossing God-given boundaries. So it's not just, we didn't commit adultery. Oh, no. It's what is our view of marriage? What is our view of gender? What is our view of species? What is our view of, right? All the law is an explanation of. Is that making sense to you? And so it's interesting that we just zip through it, but Moses has all these little tidbits that, when I was young, it's like, dude, people don't do that. Are you serious? And that's me growing up. Maybe I was naive. I was naive, right? But I grew up, mom and dad protected me. Like, no. And now it's like front page news. And that was, oh, that's why it's in there. Yeah? Any raised naive? Anyone still naive? I just scandalized you. Yes, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
What do you think is the impetus for it?
For it?
Well, for this, why does Satan want all of this? Homosexuality and everything that goes with it. Is it just to destroy what God has created?
Sure. What does Jesus say? The thief comes to?
Steal, kill, and destroy.
It's all about that. He's still killing and destroying the creation of God, and he does that through distortion. Right? It's the unnatural exchange. It's interesting in Romans 1 and 2. It's a product of the reprobate mind where I'm not going to honor God as God, so I'm going to begin to worship. This is weird. Some would suggest that say homosexuality or lesbianism is the ultimate form of idolatry, self-idolatry. You're idolizing yourself, which is why you're just desiring the image of self. Right? It's this weird inversion. So yeah, it's part of his whole plot to steal, kill, and destroy. And if he can undo it, it's just, wow. Okay, we'll go back to that. Sanctity of property. Old Testament understood property rights, boundaries. It's reset every 50 years. If I accidentally burn down your field, I owe you. And we'll get to it hopefully, or at least I'll get you the paradigm, and then you can do further study. There's a difference between if I borrow something and you're present with me, if I borrow something and you're not present with me, or if I rent something. There's different rules for that. Why? If I borrow, so I'm going to borrow one of your power tools, and you're with me, and I start cutting it through metal, and, dude, stop that. That's only for wood. You need a metal blade. You're there to keep me from damaging it. So in that sense, if you don't stop me, bad on you. I broke your soul, but in front of you, you would have stopped me. If I borrow it and I'm not there and I break it, when I come back and say, oh, I'm so sorry, I owe you a new soul. Because you weren't there to stop me, and I broke it, and so I owe it. If I hired it, if I rented it, which is why you always take the insurance on that. That's a modern application of this. Basically, it's you got it for the hire. All right, so you wouldn't have rented it if you didn't realize that there's a potential it's going to come back broken, and so that becomes part of the hire. So even there, the law speaks to all of those. That is part and parcel to the world in which we live. And so, yeah, all property rights. Truth. No false witnessing, no lying in today's vocabulary, no fake news, right? And then sanctity of motive, that the heart is just as important as the head. Wow. In 10 short statements, God gives the paradigm. Right relationships with Him, right relationships with time, right relationships in the world in which we live. Everything else is explanation. Does that make sense? All right, let's go to the next one. Do we need one more break? You want me to just keep going?
You need 5?
No.
We're good?
Keep going.
Keep going. All right. Let's go to the Book of the Covenant. The Book of the Covenant, the title comes to us from Exodus 20, or the beginning, I'm sorry. The title comes from Exodus 24:7, where it's going to be called the Book of the Covenant. The prologue, the introduction, is chapter 20, so it's after the 10 Commandments, if you will, and it's going to go from 20:22 to 21:1. So I'll go through, we got like 45 minutes-ish, and there's several of these I want to do, so I'm going to highlight some stuff, but this gives you a good way to just continue in your devotions and those kind of things. All right. In the prologue, here are the big headings. God speaks from heaven, so He is the authoritative voice. He reminds them of no idolatry because we only have one God, right? We have to understand that. There is, in a sense, a fear of idolatry. You don't want to go down that road because God is a jealous God, and you just don't want to mess with that. What respectful worship looks like to God, and again, this is for everyone. Let me just to kind of illustrate this, let's zero in on chapter 20 and verses 22 to 26, and then we won't get into, well, I'll do the 21 here in a moment. I just want to zero in at the end there. So I'm still in actually that should be, no, that's right. Let me just read this. This is one of those passages that I can show you. You got steps up here. Shame on you. I'm kidding. You're a guest in our church. No, I'm just relax, okay. I just had to catch your attention, wake you up. All right, yeah, here's where it's coming from. Watch this. The Lord said to Moses, you shall say to the sons of Israel, you yourselves have seen that I have spoken to you from heaven. You shall not make any other gods of silver, gods of gold, you shall not make for yourselves. So, no idolatry. You shall make an altar of earth for me. So basically, he's going to make a distinction between priestly altars, the altars that you find in tabernacle and temple, and what we call laity altars. God reveals himself somewhere, and you want to build an altar, you can do that. And it's a place of memory, right? That's what he's talking about. So you can do it. An altar of earth. You shall sacrifice on your burnt offerings, your peace offerings, your sheep, your oxen. Everywhere I cause my name to be remembered. And you have that. If you're driving along or you're in church, you go back and God he met you there and it was your Jehovah Nissi moment, your Jehovah Rapha moment, your Jehovah whatever moment, right? And you go back and it says, it's the altar, right? You didn't actually construct an altar, but it's a place of memory that God has revealed himself to you. That's what Moses is talking about. Now watch. If you make one of these altars of stone, don't you dare cut the stones. For if you wield your tool on it, you will profane it. Why can't I use cut stones? And, ready, now I pointed, you shall not go up by steps to my altar, so that your nakedness will not be exposed on it. Why can't we have steps in our altar? We all have steps in our altar. And we use tools to make it. Oh, no. We are trouble. No. What is God pointing to? Be careful of idolatry. When you construct something, it's so easy to idolize it. That's why you use natural stones, not cut stones, because you don't want to get close. And be careful of indecency in worship. The pagans it was very orgiastic, right? It was all about temple prostitutes. We talked about that. It's all about sex and wildness. Remember, they sat down to eat and they rose up to play. Remember when the Moabites kind of get the people of God distracted with that? It was a drunken, gluttonous orgy. And remember Phineas, right? The spear and all that kind of stuff. So and God says, no. If you're going to worship me, no idolatry and no indecency. This is not idolatrous and this is not indecent. It could become idolatrous because the only place you can meet God is here. Now you've just made it an idol. Because you can meet God anywhere. This is a place that God maybe has caused his name to be remembered, but it's not the only place you meet God. So the idea that we have tools that we've used in the construction of our churches, and we have steps in the construction of our service, of our churches, but we want to avoid idolatry and indecency in worshiping God. Why? Because remember, he's holy. And he will not share his glory with anyone or anything. And so you get the idea. So it's a weird thing, like, do we have to worry about this? Yeah, we do. But it's not like we're actually going to go out and take dirt and build some. It's that when God reveals himself to me, I want to make sure that place, that memory, doesn't become idolatrous and or indecent. So that's part of that opening. Okay, cases involving slaves, Exodus 21 and following. This is where you get the whole 6-year thing, and then you're released in the 7th, right? So it's actually going to combine the slave issue and, in a sense, the Sabbath issue. And then what does it now? Don't think American slavery. This is not about a racial oppression. This is much more indentured service, right? You got. In fact, it's kind of interesting. Probably the closest we come to it is if you claim bankruptcy. You're under the bankruptcy usually for 7 years, and then you're free. Why 7 years? It comes from the text, right? That you got into bad financial situations, you sold yourself into financial slavery, and you have to work it off, and then after that time, your debt is freed, right? You're able to start all over again. It's a way to redeem people so that they can reset, and that becomes part of it. And then so if you didn't bring anything in, you don't take anything out. If you brought a wife in, you take the wife out. If you didn't bring anything in, but you get the wife, And now you want to be redeemed, but you want to stay. That's that whole idea of, you put the ear and the all on there because you become the love slave or the love servant. It's in the sense of that you're able to stay because, in fact, in the ancient Near Eastern world, sometimes being a servant in someone's house was actually easier than being on your own if, in fact, you weren't very, didn't have a lot of resources or those kind of things. So it's different. When we hear slavery, we think American slavery. That's not what we're hearing. We're hearing much more about indentured service, and he has a lot to say about that. Notice at the end, it gets kind of weird here, and again, for what it's worth, if you sell your daughter as a female slave, in the sense that, again, people do this. So I'm in bondage. I'm in debt. My child becomes the way that I pay off that debt, right? They're going to earn that. And this is what's weird, because in some ways it's like it's anti-woman. No, just hear it. She's not to go free as the male slaves do. Usually what he's talking about is you become almost like a concubine or a mistress. So no one's going to want to marry you. So we don't just take a girl, keep her for 7 years, give her someone else, keep her for 7 years, no. Male slaves, you don't have that. That's not part of the assumption. Female slaves, you just don't do that. If she's displeasing the eyes of her master who designated her for himself, so again, it's much more conjugal, then let her be redeemed. He doesn't have the authority to sell her to foreign people, because that's unfair. You can't just take and abuse people and then pass them off or discard them. You're not valuing the dignity of another human being. And Moses says you can't do that. And watch this. This doesn't, in our culture, the principle is there, right? If he takes himself another woman, so now all of a sudden it's polygamy, right? I have many concubines. So think even a guy like Jacob, he's got 2 wives and 2 concubines, right? The mistresses of his wives. If he takes himself another woman, he can't reduce her food, her clothing, her conjugal rights. You can't just say, I'm done with you. Well, you can stay in the house, but you're not going to get it fed. But you can't treat people with disrespect, especially when you took advantage of them in the first place. Does that make sense? So there's this value of personhood rather than just passing them off. And if he doesn't do these 3 things, then she goes out for nothing. In other words, your bad behavior has redeemed her and has released her. So again, what looks like, these are like weird laws. No. It's about human dignity. It's about you don't trash someone and then just, I'm bad, I guess you're on your own here. It's taking care of them and providing for them, right? It's all about that. So everything about the slavery. Okay, homicide, Exodus 21 and following. The sacredness of life, he's going to begin with that. He who strikes a man so that he dies shall surely be put to death. Then he goes through a whole bunch of different categories, right? So unintentional death, premeditated death, all of those things are going to be part of what does that look like, right? In terms of honoring human life. And then, and this is where it gets really kind of interesting, then it begins to be extended in applications, all right? So it talks about cursing father or mother, kidnapping, striking mom or dad, striking someone and they have a temporary illness or disability, striking someone and they have a permanent one. He's going to deal with all of those. They all become the extensions of, right, the sacredness of life. And then we'll have to cross-reference this to Numbers 35. I'll get to that in a moment. But the role of eyewitnesses. You never do capital punishment on the basis of one eyewitness, right? It's got to be 2 or 3. So we have that. Okay. 21, 18 and following. Bodily injury, caring for human life, debilitating injury. What happens if the master strikes this indentured servant? What goes on? I'm going to skip something. I'm going to come back to it. An injury to a slave. Let's do 2. Let's go to 22 to 25. I'm in Exodus 21, 22 to 25. If men struggle with each other and strike a woman with child, she's pregnant, so that she gives birth prematurely, yet there is no injury, he shall surely be fined as the woman's husband may demand of him, and he shall pay as the judges decide. But if there's any further injury, Then you shall appoint as penalty, then this is what we call the lex talionis, right? The law of the claw, talon, right? The lex talionis is the law of the claw. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a claw for a claw. You shall appoint as penalty, life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. What's the context? It's this. Two guys fighting, pregnant woman. Pregnant woman gets hit. She goes into premature labor. Baby comes out fine. You financially punish the man who caused that premature birth, but the baby is alive, no further hurt. But in order to make sure that you are careful in the future, there is a financial penalty. If there is any further injury, right, meaning death, lex talionis, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, claw for claw, bruise for bruise, says what? It says that the unborn has the rights of personhood. That's why we're against abortion. Because the Bible holds that the unborn has the same rights as the born. If you kill the baby, it's an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. If there's premature birth but there's no harm, pay, because you got to be careful, right? That's going to be that financial thing. But if there's death, it'll be just like killing somebody else. And then when you add to that, Jeremiah, you knew me and you called me, and John the Baptist and Jesus and all the other scriptures. But here we have the law pointing to the fact that if an abortionist kills a baby, it's a medical procedure. If an individual kills a pregnant woman, it's a double homicide. In our culture? Scott Peterson? Hello, wait a minute, whoa. If the doctor does it, it's not a person. If a criminal does it, it is a person.
Logically consistent.
Well, yes, it's very, very logical, very, very consistent, right? No, they're missing the point. You get that? That's so cool. Now watch this one. Jump down to 28. If an ox gores a man or a woman to death, the ox shall surely be stoned, and its flesh not eaten. The assumption is there's something wrong with it. Maybe it's rabbit or something like that, right? So you don't want to eat a wild ox. But the owner of the ox shall go unpunished. Okay, I didn't know. My ox was crazy. It killed somebody. The ox dies, but, well, it gores somebody. Yeah, well, it kills somebody. If, however, an ox was previously in the habit of goring, and its owner has been warned, yet he doesn't confine it, and it kills a man, the ox shall be stoned, and its owner shall also be put to death. Now, if the ransom is demanded, he can. So other than actual murder, you can, it's almost like life imprisonment as opposed to capital punishment. There's another way to redeem other kinds of death, except for intentional premeditated. Then this is biblical, not today's jurisprudence. You're able to redeem it. So that's what he's going on here. You're able to redeem. This is true if it's son or daughter, if it's male or female slave. Oh, male or female slave, all these things. The ox shall be stoned. You're going to pay. You're going to do those kind of things. Now, here's what's interesting about that. This whole rule of the ox gorer is based on knowledge. If you knew and you didn't take the care to protect, you're liable. If you didn't know, it's ignorance. Now, most of us don't worry about oxen. Did you ever worry about a wild dog living next door? And that dog is known to bite and devour. And the owner doesn't take care of it, and it mauls the child to death? That's a whole different scenario than, I didn't know. The dog just freaked. You get the idea? So maybe we don't worry about that in its context, but it's talking about culpability based upon knowledge. And knowledge makes us culpable, right? That's the essence of it. So again, bodily injury is all part of that. Property damages, culpable negligence, right? So, where are we at? You open a pit, we already talked about this, and you don't cover it, the ox or the donkey falls in. Hey, you get the dead animal, you got to give them a living animal. Here again, the ox hurts someone, you're going to divide it up, you divide the dead animal, and then again, if it's known that the ox was previously in the habit of goring, so again, it's a sin against knowledge. It's culpability. What's going on there? From theft, you're going to pay back 22, 1-4. Loss from goods. This is where we talked about it already. You're borrowing something. What happens that it gets lost? Did you embezzle your neighbor? There's a breach of contract there. All those kinds of rules are going to be part of this. It speaks of stealing, embezzling, loss, death, whether you're hired. I already kind of talked about that. Property damages. Cases involving society. Now this is where it gets like really funky to us, right? The law of virgins in verses 16 to 17. The law of sorcery in verse 18. You should not allow a sorceress to live. Bestiality, we already mentioned this. Whoever lies with an animal shall surely be put to death. Again, I'm not advocating this. You understand that. I'm just saying this is the logic. If, in fact, transgenderism is a thing, you are as you identify, then there is no reason logically to hold that transspeciesism is not a thing. You can't argue against that logically, right? Because the basis of the logic is I am as I identify. So if I identify as the woman, I am the woman. If I identify as the cat, I am the cat. If I identify, and in a sense, again, Satan, it's the distortion. And so very, very clear law. Old Testament, they're saying, you can't do, which tells us that this is an age-old problem. It just has come to light because we've so totally rejected this Judeo-Christian ethic in the West.
Well, and we do have stories, reports of, what do they call it, kitty litter in high school bathrooms. So, it's interesting.
So in a sense, and yes, I'm familiar with the reports. And I like this, right? If it's true or not, we'll let our fake news people tell us if it's true or not, right? Honesty and truth telling. If it's true, then what we're saying is that the student who identifies the cat can use the litter box as opposed to the commode. Makes perfect sense. No, it makes perfect sense. Think about it. It makes perfect sense if you are as you think, as opposed to you are as you are. When you deny reality, anything is possible. You're a unicorn. Even though unicorns don't exist. You think you're a unicorn, you're a unicorn. You can be that which doesn't even exist because you are what you think as opposed to you are what reality says you are. Man, when you move away from reality, anything is possible. It's just, Jesus help. Even so, come, Lord, quickly, right? That's really that's ultimately our prayer. Yeah. Problem of idolatry, verse 20, problem of oppression into verses 21 and following, financial oppression, the cursing thing that we kind of talked about, the tithing. Now, it's interesting here in verses 29 to 30 about the delaying the offering of the harvest, the firstborn. So this idea of the tithe and the role of the tithe, it's kind of interesting because it's under the society one. When the Levite was unable to live according to the offerings of the people, it actually influenced and impacted the society. That's why, and so what you do, remember now you go down into, you study a guy like Hezekiah and Josiah and all that when they do these reforms, and the Levites are nowhere to be found and the temple is in disrepair. And they say, why? Well, because they're not bringing the tithe in. The Levite doesn't have any way to live to do the service of the temple, and so they have to go out and get the job. Because the people of God aren't doing, right? You get the idea? So here, even in the law, it becomes an issue of society because the idea is that the Levite and the tithe was to assist, not only so that the priest could do their thing, but that the poor, the triennial tithe, would have access. So again, it's this idea we give, not just because God says to give, but because it influences. It allows the temple to be, in our context, the church, and it allows the poor to be taken care of. Okay. And then we already talked about don't eat any flesh that's torn to pieces in the field. The whole, again, whatever your view is, the roadkill thing, chapter 22, verse 31. Cases involving justice and neighbors. I labeled 23:1 again as fake news. You shall not bear a false report. Do not join your hand with a wicked man to be a malicious witness. Come on, guys, stop. You know this is our struggle right now. Let's face it, right? We are in a major crisis in the West because what used to be the proponents of truth, the role of journalism, the role of government, the role of various agencies within government, we trusted that they would tell us true things. The pandemic and then everything else that happens surrounding that has so eroded the trust, most of us, when we're watching, listen, even what we just did about the kitty litter, right? It says, well, it's reported, but I don't know if it's true, because so many other things that they report are not true. Once you allow the false witness to become part and parcel to the culture, you start not believing anything, right? We have this crisis of confidence in authority figures that it ought to be their yes is yes and their no is no. And now all of a sudden, because of so many noble lies, remember that, and so many of these other things where all of a sudden it's like, I have no idea if you're telling me the truth or not. Am I supposed to listen or what? Right? And that's the reason why you don't bear false witness. This is not in my notes. This is free. The rabbi disciple came to the rabbi and said, the law says thou shalt not bear false witness. Why? The rabbi said, I'll answer your question tomorrow. Here's what I want you to do. Go take a feather, think about down feathers, and put a feather on the doorstep of each of your neighbors and come back and see me tomorrow. The disciple went and put the feather on the doorstep of each of his neighbors. He came back to the rabbi the next day and he said, okay, Rabbi, now why should we not bear false witness? He said, I'll tell you the answer tomorrow, but I want you to do something for me today. I want you to go gather up those feathers. And the disciple said, I can't. They blew away. He said, that's why you don't bear false witness. You can't control it. In ancient Near Eastern world, it was just gossip. In our world, man, the internet is permanent. You bear false witness, and it's remembered, right? And you can't take it back. You just can't take it back. Is that making sense? So this whole idea of holiness and truth-telling, man, what happens when we live in a culture or society? Remember our premise. What happens when we live in a culture or society where truth is not valued? Everyone is suspicious. No one is believed, right? And that becomes ultimately the destruction. Okay, sacred seasons. He'll talk about Sabbath and the 3 feasts, right? That's all part of that. And then the epilogue or the ending of it. So we have the 10, and now we have, in a sense, this book of the covenant that describes it, and it goes into all those details of it, right? And so you can read and you can kind of process that, and I've given you kind of a frame of reference. Let's go to the next one, Leviticus 18. This is called the law of holiness. So we have the book of the covenant and the law of holiness, Leviticus 18 and following. And you see up there it says some introductory notes. The term itself, the law of holiness, is not scripture. Unlike the book of the covenant that we actually have a chapter and verse for, this was actually coined by a guy named Klosterman in 1877. You don't need to worry about that, other than I'm telling you that they see this content and they want to name it. All right, and so that's what they do. Chapter 17 deals with a whole bunch of ceremonial laws and moral laws, and chapters 21 to 26 deals with a lot of ceremonial stuff. So in the middle of that, chapters 18 to 20, it almost seems to be a literary unit within a larger unit. All right, so that's what we're, I'm still under introductory thoughts, right? So chapter 17 is a mixed bag, 21 to 26 is a mixed bag, 18 to 20, there seems to be a formal introduction, a formal closing, and so many are going to say, let's use 18 to 20 as this kind of, this literary unit, right? The law of holiness, and then we go through it. There's holiness in sexual behavior. And so it begins in chapter 18, all the customs of the pagan nations, right? Don't do these kinds of things. Chapter 18, verses 1 to 5. So he speaks of, again, we don't want to reflect the pagans, we want to reflect our God. Verses 6 to 20, he describes all kinds of what we would know of as incest or illicit sex. And this is where we know monogamy, polygamy, polyandry, right? Monogamy, marriage of one, polygamy, one man, many wives, polyandry, one woman, many husbands. Biblically, there's also what we call endogamy and exogamy. Think of a bullseye with all these circles. Exogamy says it has to be outside of a certain circle for it to be legitimate. That's how the Bible explains incest. And incest is not just bloodlines, right? So when Paul deals, 1 Corinthians 5, actually reported a man has his father's wife, it's a stepmom. No blood relations, it's still wrong because there's too close of a connection. You can't have relations with your father's brother's wife. Your aunt by marriage. Well, there's no blood there. Yeah, no. It's so the circle. It's got to be out of a certain circle for it to be legit. Endogamy is it has to be within a certain circle to be legitimate. And so for Israel, it's only marry other Israelites. But it's not because of ethnic or racial things, right? How do I know that? Because of Ruth, because of Rahab, because of Tamar, because of Bathsheba, the 4 ladies that show up in the genealogy of Jesus in Matthew, all non-Israelites. It was a spiritual thing. Ruth to Naomi, your people, my people, your God, my God, come on in. Rahab, we heard, I want to adopt. No problem. Come on in. So you have, and in New Testament times, that's why we say don't be unequally yoked, right? So we want to marry within the circle of Christians. We want to marry outside certain circles to avoid this undue kind of relationship. All that is described in this whole passage, right? Verses 6 to 20. All kind of pagan deviations, verses 21 to 27, human sacrifice. And now look verse 22. Don't lie with a male as one lies with a female. So homosexuality. You shall not have intercourse with any animal to be defiled, nor shall a woman stand before an animal to mate. It's a perversion. So abomination and perversion. This idea of same-gendered or cross-species, right? It's explicit in the text. No, this is anti what God has established. You're blurring the lines. Don't do that. And so he describes all of that, right? The consequence. Oh, this is so critical. Consequence. Go to 18:24. Do not defile yourselves by any of these things, for by these things, do not defile yourselves by any of these things. For by all these, the nations which I'm casting out before you have become defiled. The land has become defiled. Therefore, I brought its punishment upon it, so that the land has spewed out its inhabitants. But as for you, you're to keep my statutes and judgments, and shall not do any of these abominations. Neither the native, the alien who sojourns, the men of the land have done all these. The land has been defiled. The land will spew. So again, if you do it, the land won't spew you out. If you do it, the land will spew you out. Whoever does this shall be cut off. Why is this so interesting? Modern day, people who think they know everything, right? Sorry about that. Say that the Bible, God commands genocide. He says that the Israelites go in and wipe people out. No. God does not command genocide. God commands justice. And what is the justice? The justice is that and notice, he's punishing the pagan and kicking them out of the land because they're breaking the conscience of what they know to be right or wrong. He's holding the nations accountable, and Israel is simply the arm of justice. When Israel forgot God, what did God do to Israel? Kicks him out of the land. So it's not genocide, it's divine justice. All right, that God is going to do this. And God is really, really clear on that, which is why God says to Abraham, Abraham, see all this? It's yours, but not yet. Why not, God? Genesis 15:16, because the sin of the Amorite is not yet complete. If I allowed you to come in and kick them out, it would be pre-justice. You got to wait. You got to let evil run its course. And when evil run its course, then it's justice. All right, so really kind of interesting there. All right, holiness and social ethics. Where am I at? Chapter 19, parents, Sabbath, idols, regarding for the poor, regarding for truth, regarding others in your care. 19:13 and 14, very important. Don't oppress your neighbor or rob him. The wages of a hired man are not to remain with you. Verse 14, don't curse a deaf man or place a stumbling block before the blind. What? Don't curse a deaf man or place a stumbling block before the blind. You stand behind the deaf man. He can't hear you. And you're just having a day of it. You're taking advantage of him. The blind person. Oh, here comes a blind person. Put the chair in front of him. You're taking advantage of people who don't have any kind of way to defend themselves. One scholar puts it this way. The spirit of these precepts is to forbid not only the ridiculing of bodily infirmities, but the taking advantage in any case of the ignorance, simplicity, or inexperience of others, particularly the giving of bad counsel to those who are simple, easily imposed upon, which they may be led to do something to their own injury. You can't take advantage of people who can't provide or take care of themselves. That's not moral. There's no abortion. No, never mind. Okay, let's just keep going. Who speaks for the baby? They're taking advantage of a child. And by the way, you know that the baby screams in the womb when they inject it with the salt, so you know they don't like it. Never mind. Regard for the rich, 19:15 to 16. Regard for your neighbor. This is where Jesus gets love your neighbor as yourself. Regard for the decrees of God. Okay, that's that one. Worship and holiness and worship. No Moloch, no mediums, no spiritists. Holiness in family relations. Capital punishment. And he goes through a whole bunch: adultery, incest, homosexuality, bestiality, etc. Let's go to the next one.
Next screen.
Oh. Yeah, it's okay. I'm going to read. This is so good. You ready? This is a summary of everything what we just did in the Holiness Code. The church needs to come back to the full recognition of the principles which underlie the Levitical Code, especially of the fact that marriage and the family are not merely civil arrangements, but divine institutions, so that God has not left it to the caprice of a majority to settle what shall be lawful in these matters. God has declared not merely the material well-being of man, but holiness is the moral end of government and of life. And he will find ways to enforce his will in this respect. Remember, he caused the nations to be spewed. The nation that will not serve him shall perish. All this is not theology merely, or ethics, but history. All history witnesses that moral corruption and relaxed legislation, especially in matters affecting the relations of the sexes, brings in their train sure retribution, not in Hades, but here on earth. Let us know, mistaking the lesson by imagining that this law was for Israel but not for other peoples. The contrary is affirmed by this very chapter, where we are reminded that God visited his heavy judgments upon the Canaanitish nations precisely for this very thing. Their doing of these things, which are in the law of holiness forbidden. Again, they knew they were culpable. Hence, the land spewed them out. Our modern democracies, English, American, French, German, or whatever they be, would do well to pause in their progressive repudiation of the law of God in many social questions and heed this solemn warning. For, despite the unbelief of multitudes, the Holy One still governs the world, and it is certain that he will never abdicate his throne of righteousness to submit any of his laws to the sanction of popular vote. Powerful, right? Watch this. Next slide. It was written in 1891.
Wow.
This is history. This isn't theology. You don't sin with impunity. Back then they knew morality is not something that the majority votes. Are you getting? God holds everyone culpable for what has been written. Whether from conscience or whether from, in a sense, the codification of it, he holds everyone accountable. It's just powerful. Okay, the last one, Law of Deuteronomy. Woohoo! All right. Deuteronomy chapter 12 to 15. Again, you can go back and study all this stuff. I know I'm just like overwhelming you. Stephen Kaufman, what he does is he takes the 10 Commandments, and then what he does is he gives the kind of the parallel of all the sections where the 10 Commandments are further described. So Commandment 1 and 2 is about worship. That's in chapter 12. Taking the name of God, again, with its respect, chapter 13 to 14. The Sabbath day, 14 to 16. Authority, 16 to 18. So Kaufman says, look, there's a nice kind of parallel between the contents of the law and then the description of this moral code. All right, so let's go to the next one. We'll just go through this step by step. In worship, again, destroying pagan altars, establishing true places of worship, provisions for the place of worship, no false gods. That's all going to be the worship stuff in chapter 12. The name of God, 13 to 14, sanctifying God's name. And this is kind of a cool thing, kind of study this out. Apostasy by prophets, by brothers, by scoundrels. He goes through a category of people saying, be careful, be careful, be careful, right? No pagan rites, no unclean flesh, all of that. The Sabbath issue, the triennial tithe, so that either a third of the tithe each year or every third year's tithe, it goes to the poor, right? To the people who have nothing. The sabbatical year, the release of the servitude, the law of the firstlings, and then Passover, weeks, and booths, the three main festivals, authority issues, the role of the judges. We got to do the role of kings. All right, this is so cool. again, I know I'm like, I have to hit it because I'm watching the time. I really am. Okay. The law of kings. Look at Deuteronomy 17. This is so cool. Think this is Moses predicting what's going to happen to Israel. They're going to ask for a king. Think they actually do that under Samuel and Saul. And then think of Solomon, who's supposedly the wisest king who ever lived. And someday read Ecclesiastes in light of this. This is what you're doing. When you enter, this is 17:14. When you enter the land which the Lord your God gives you, you possess it. Say, I'm going to set a king over all the nations who are around me. You shall surely set a king over you whom the Lord your God chooses. One from your countrymen you shall set up for yourselves, not a foreigner. Moreover, ready? Don't multiply horses. You shall cause the people to return to Egypt to multiply horses, for the Lord said, don't ever go back there. Don't multiply wives, else his heart will turn away. He'll greatly increase silver and gold. When it comes about when he sits on the throne, he shall write himself a copy of the law in the presence of the Levitical priests. You're going to know this because you're going to handwrite it, and the priest is going to make sure that you're handwriting it so that you don't leave anything out. It shall be with him. He shall read it all the days of his life. He may learn to fear the Lord. His heart may not be lifted above his countrymen, that he may not turn aside to the commandment to the right or to the left, so that he and his sons may not continue long in his kingdom. Don't multiply horses. Don't multiply women. Don't multiply money. And be careful that you don't lift your heart up against others. Power, money, sex, pride. What do most leaders fail at? Power, sex, money, pride. It's as old as God saying to Moses, tell the future kings to be careful. This is what's going to trip you up. Power corrupts the power holder, right? All that. It's just like, wow, it's just there. Read Ecclesiastes where Solomon's saying, oh, if only, right? It's really good stuff. Okay. Priesthood, prophets, all that kind of sanctity of life, chapter 19. The motive in the loss of life, the whole boundary issue, the testimony issue. This is important. Go to 19:15. A single witness shall not rise up against a man on account of any iniquity or sin which he has committed on the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. So it's not just he said, she said. It's got to be 2 or 3 witnesses, collaborating evidence, really important. That's part of our judicial code. Watch this one, though. If a malicious witness rises up against a man to accuse him of wrongdoing, then both the men who have the dispute shall stand before the Lord, the priests and the judges. They're going to investigate. If the witness is a false witness, he has accused his brother falsely, then you shall do to him just as he is intended to do to his brother. What do you do to a false witness? So I said that you killed someone and you didn't, and I found to be lying. I am put to death, not you. I say you stole and you didn't. I pay, right? You have to take the false witness and punish the false witness, or we're back to fake news prevails, right? It's just part. Now watch this. Why do you do this? The rest will, so you got to do it. You got to purge the evil from you, among you. The rest will hear and be afraid. It's a deterrence. When you lose the law as a deterrence, you lose the ability to live in a peaceful society. Because who cares? I can get away with anything. The law's lost its deterrency. Thus you shall, and now we're back to lex talionis. Thus you shall not show pity, life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Wow, right? You have to live in a culture or society that truth means something, right? Or it all simply self-destructs. Okay. Oh, yeah, that was what? That was chapter 19, sanctity of life. Law of the war, that's important. You fight people, not land. He's got all kind of no scorched earth policy. That's part of the law. Law of the war bride, loved and unloved wives, rebellious people, property issues, transgender issues, the bird issues. So you can take the mother bird, but not the eggs. You can take the eggs, but not the mother bird. You're respecting life. You're not destroying a whole family, even of birds, right? God sees all that. Sexual purity issues, stealing, all forms, interest, vows, theft of personhood, that's the divorce issue, theft of happiness, false witness, no covenant. All right, let's finish it up. You hear what we said? What's the law pointing us to? Right relationships with God. What's internal worship look like? What's our external worship look like? What does our verbal worship look like? God cares about how we approach him. And the law instructs us in those things, right? So it's not just 10 commandments. man, this is how you approach God. This is what you're careful with altars with steps and altars that you've constructed. Not because there's anything inherently wrong in steps and construction, but you don't want to go down the road of idolatry or indecency. Right? Does that make sense? So that's all part of it. Go to the next one. Right relations with time. Right? We kind of dealt with this. The whole Sabbath concept. It for you, not you for it. Jesus is Lord even of the Sabbath. The Sabbath isn't just about a day. It's about getting a good night's rest because you can say, God, you got it. It's about taking a day off a week because you say, God, you got it. It's about living in rhythms of life, whether it's vacations, 3 times a year. You go up to Jerusalem and worship because you're saying, God, you got it. It's on you. We don't do the sabbatical year, 6 years of work. Many of our farmers will do that with their land. Right? You have to do the crop rotation. You don't just keep depleting the earth. So even maybe we don't. But however, Ed Minaldino, Pastor Minaldino, that was my first guy I worked under. He said this, and I really found it interesting. And it was true in my life. I don't know if it's going to be true in your life. You ever heard of the 7-year itch? Right? He actually held, and he bases it on this. He says every 7 years there's a natural cycle in who we are. And the 7-year itch shows up in the marriage thing, but he really was speaking of it in terms of our work issue. When I went to work with him, he was already a pastor for 35 years. And he said every 7 years he had to kind of reset. Am I going to stay, or is this a time of transition? Okay, I'll stay. And there's almost this natural tendency that every 7 years you reevaluate life, right? Because it's a natural progression of Sabbath. You might stick with the job, but maybe you take on a different flavor to it or a different emphasis. But it's like every 7 years you reset. You got to reevaluate. You got to come back. And I can honestly say this, right? I remember because I've been at the Forge. I'm in my 27th year, which means what? I'm at the end of my 4th, 6th, and next year is Sabbath year. And I keep saying to my wife, and plus part of my age, like, what's the next thing? Are we ready to move on? What's the next thing? No, we're still here. Okay. But it's that idea. Is it time to reset? Is it time to do something? There's a natural cycle to it, right? So even though we don't take the Sabbath year, there might be something that actually speaks to us in those rhythms of time. All this speaks to lordship, obedience, trust, all that kind of stuff. Sabbath reminds us of all that. All right, next one. Right? Relations with others. Man, we did it, right? Family, society at large, the poor, the needy, the widow, the orphan, the life, the premeditated murder. You know that right now we have what would you call it? Maybe a plague of suicide among young people, especially girls. 2007, we saw the charts flip. 2007 was the introduction of the iPhone. We had smartphones prior to, but 2007, everything kind of changed in social media. And what we found was teen pregnancy went downhill, alcoholism, drug use, but depression, anxiety, and the worst marker was suicide among young ladies. Right? And this idea of murder, I actually have a quote by a commentator. He says, again, the idea of self-murdering. By immoderate and superstitious fasting, willful neglect of health, addiction to riot and excess, to drunkenness, gluttony, extravagant pleasure, inactivity, slothfulness, result of fierce and furious passion. We live in a world that we're constantly attacking ourselves. Right, and then it takes the epitome, right? It takes the ultimate form where young people, when they should have so much ahead of them, they think the only solution is self-destruction. Wow, we need more children's pastors. That's what we need, buddy. All right, that's life. Marriage and sex. Well, the unborn, we already talked about that. Marriage and sex, the ideal, Genesis 2, he allows other things, but there are some things he never allows, even though our world says we can allow that. Possession. Wealth, stealing, property, necessity of truth, motive. I think we did all this. Let's go to the final one here. We got to end in Deuteronomy 6, because this kind of summarizes, I think, hopefully what we have been saying. Pick up in verse 20. When your son asks you in time to come, saying, what do the testimonies and the statutes and the judgments mean, which the Lord our God commanded you? Like, come on, what's this about, Dad? Help me. You shall say to your son, we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, and the Lord brought us out from Egypt with a mighty hand. Moreover, the Lord showed great distressing signs and wonders before our eyes against Egypt, Pharaoh, and all your household. He brought us out from there in order to bring us in, to give us the land which he had sworn to our fathers. So the Lord commanded us, because he brings us out. Remember, covenant precedes the commands. So the Lord commanded us to observe all these statutes, to fear the Lord our God. Ready? This is the takeaway. For our good always and for our survival, as it is today. We cannot flourish as a people, as a nation, as a society, if we disregard the moral code that God has given in conscience, in law, in revelation. There's no good, there's no survival in denying the things that God says. One God. You got to honor time. You got to know how to live in groups. You got to respect relationships and property and truth and intent. It's for our good. It's for our survival. And here we are we're trying to go back to your statement. We're trying to say that, no, you can flourish by not keeping this stuff. And it's like, no, it will self-destruct. It has to self-destruct. Why? You're destroying the way God created the world to work. There is still a thing called good and evil. 1891. This isn't theology, this is history. You can't sin against God as a people, as a nation with impunity. It just doesn't work. We have to pray. We have to intercede. We have to witness. We have to stand strong. We have to be strong in the midst of persecution. Why? Because somebody has to stand up for what God believes. That's our call. Jesus, I thank you so much for these beautiful people, for their desire to know you, to serve you, to give testimony to you. Make them strong. Help each of us not to waver in the midst of a crazy world that wants to call evil good and good evil. Help us to remind ourselves, to refresh ourselves that, God, this is not you being mean and angry. This is you telling us this is how you survive. This is how you flourish. This is how you live the life that you intended for us. And help us to somehow, Lord, even if it's in small little ways, convince our neighbors, our friends, our family. Help us to be that witness. Help us to be that voice of reason, the voice of sanity, the voice of one crying in the wilderness. Prepare the way of the Lord. God, give us boldness, give us courage, give us wisdom, and we'll be sure to give you all honor, glory, and praise. Keep us true, Lord Jesus. Keep us true. We ask this in Jesus' name. And everybody said, Amen. Amen. God bless you guys. I hope it wasn't overwhelming. I apologize. God bless. God bless.